3 minutes after 10 is the time. Let's get the joke out of the way early. This is from Pete, and I quite like it, in Newcastle. He says, James, do you think Chris Philp had the same geography teacher as Dominic Raab? So we should be looking at the Chris Philp story. If you're not familiar with it, I think even by the standards of current Conservative ministers, even by the talent puddle seems too generous, doesn't it, when you look at some of the people that Rishi Sunak has promoted, but even by the standards, by the shallowness of the talent puddle from which ministerial appointments are made. Chris Philp's performance on Question Time last night suggests that whatever it is below the bottom of the barrel, when the bottom of the barrel has been scraped away, whatever remains is now a policing minister, and until very recently an immigration minister who doesn't appear to know anything about anything. Laura Trott levels of ignorance, actually. But what I really want to do at 11 o'clock is turn that into a conversation. At this point in history, I'm not sure how to. I am, however, pretty clear on how I'm going to turn news that shoplifting has hit a 20-year high into a conversation. That's the offences logged. Highest level since records began 21 years ago. I mean, who is surprised? Yeah, precisely. You can almost hear the tumbleweed bouncing across the studio floor. 430,104 offences recorded in England and Wales alone, which is up 37% on the previous 12 months. And how many have not been recorded? How many offences have gone absolutely unremarked, unrecorded, unreported? I cautiously suggest a lot more than have been. So I'm going to take you back to, I think it was 1987, the summer of 1987. I'm going to tell you a story that I have shared before, but it occurred to me this morning that it's the perfect way to highlight how much things have changed. Not just since last year, or indeed since 21 years ago when comparable records began, but since I was a child. I'm going to tell you about what even now constitutes one of the worst days of my life. It's not up there with bereavement, obviously, or you know, life-changing events. But in the context of what it does to your tummy when you remember it, 37 years later, in some ways it still feels to me as if it were yesterday. So I grew up in a town called Kidderminster, which doesn't have a lot to recommend it. I can say that, you can't. It's like family, isn't it? It doesn't have a lot to recommend it, but it did, like most towns of similar size, used to have a proper town centre around which, in the summer holidays, you could sort of wander. And if hopefully you'd hook up with a couple of mates, or you'd bump into somebody, or you'd arrange to meet outside our price. But even then, if you couldn't do that, it was quite pleasant to wander around on your own, especially if, like me, you were at a very isolated boarding school for the rest of the time. In the middle of nowhere, where even something that everybody else takes for granted, like access to a record shop or a McDonald's, was denied. A completely alien prospect for weeks on end as we kicked our heels and twiddled our thumbs in the middle of the North Yorkshire moors, in my case. And I was always skint as a kid. I realise now that Mum and Dad had spent all their money on school fees, and I just remember that period as never really having any cash. It's why, oddly, I undertook some entrepreneurial adventures at roughly the same time, actually, but that's a story for another day. And it meant I never had a music collection. I never had new games for my Spectrum. I always had to try and copy them off other people. Or I remember washing my neighbour's car once and clocking that he had like 10, 15 brand new cassettes in his car. And I just asked if I could copy them all. And even buying the blank cassettes onto which I copied all his albums was an expenditure I could barely stretch to. So I was always skint. And I was a well-brought-up child who understood the difference between right and wrong. In fact, the event that I'm about to relate to you, I brought up in confession with a Catholic priest, so I carried around Catholic guilt. Like these days, you carry around a mobile phone. But for reasons I never really fully understood or established, and it didn't last very long, my local branch of Woolworths was keeping the vinyl in the sleeves on the record display. So do you remember when they'd have the whole top 40 would be on display in the shop, but the sleeves were always empty. The vinyl was never in them. You'd take the sleeve to the counter, and the shop assistant would then get the record from behind the counter and put it in the sleeve. For some reason, Woolworths briefly kept the vinyl in the sleeves, and I stole some. I stole some. I went to Our Price and bought something from the 99p basket. I can't remember what. I think, oddly enough, it might have been the 12-inch version of When the Wind Blows by David Bowie, but we'd have to check the dates. And because I now had an LP-sized plastic bag, I went into Woolworths and I inserted into that bag, not one, not two, but about 5 LPs, which just about stuffed it to bursting point. And with my heart in my mouth and my blood pumping in full fight or flight fashion, I made my way out of Woolworths and carried on going about my business. So I think I went and got a sandwich in Marks and Spencer's, and popped down into Smith's to have a look at the Spectrum games that I couldn't afford. And as I got to the top of the escalator, or the bottom of the escalator, in the shopping precinct where Sounds Around record shop used to be, for anyone following this from the perspective of having grown up in Kidderminster or nearby, you know the one I mean. There was a hand on my shoulder, and it was a uniformed police officer who said something like, "Can we have a look in the bag, son?" And I just immediately said, I'm very sorry, I've stolen some records. And the reason I was at the bottom of the escalator was because Mum was about to pick me up on the roundabout. And she pulls up in her car, in her white Renault 5, and pulls up in her car and sees me in the clutches of, I think, if memory serves, I think 2 police officers, but there were 2 more at the top of the escalator, because that's when, obviously, I know it sounds odd, particularly given what we're about to talk about, but the 15-year-old me had prompted a proper police operation, so that there were police at the top of the escalator and police at the bottom, so that if I had decided to bolt or leg it, I wouldn't have had anywhere to go. It wasn't the Swan Centre, actually. No, that was a slightly different... well, no, you're right. It was the Swans. It was the other end of the Swan Centre from where the Swans were, wasn't it? Yeah, of course it was. Thank you for that. Someone knows. Thank you, Lee. Someone who knows his kiddie. So I got to the to the escalators, and the hand on the shoulder, and then Mum pulls up in the Renault, and she sees what's going on, and I say, "Can I just tell my mum what's happened, please?" And I don't think I was allowed to, in case she was my getaway driver, and I was going to jump into the back of her Renault 5 with my 5 stolen LPs from Woolworths, and she was going to hot-foot it out of there like Starsky and Hutch. So I think a police officer went over, and I just remember my mum, obviously, can you imagine? Oh, God, this is awful. Can you imagine what it was like for her? Just for a moment, what it was like for her. 15 years old. Oh, dear. And I remember her plaintive cry reaching my burning ears. And she said something like, "You'll never be a lawyer now." And because at the time I had hopes of becoming a barrister, perhaps, or a lawyer, and we talked about it, and it was... And what happened next, I think that younger listeners will find almost impossible to believe. So 2 police officers put me in the back of their car, drove me to Kidderminster police station, and arrested me. I presume I would have been charged, wouldn't I? And I sat in a police interview room for what can't have been hours, but I was still there when my dad arrived, and my dad had been in Birmingham. So, give or take, it's 40 minutes, really. So there must have been... So I was locked in a cell. They took my shoelaces. Good God, I haven't thought about this in decades. I had some brown suede brogues at the time that I was incredibly proud of. And they took the shoelaces out of my brown suede brogues and put me in a cell where there was graffiti on the walls and a hard bench and a thin. I mean, happily, I'd been at boarding school, so I wasn't that perturbed by the facilities. But a thin cushion type thing, and I'm in a state of trance almost. So I'm in there for goodness knows how long. I get taken out. I'm underage, so I have to be accompanied for the interview, which meant Mum sat there at first. And then goodness knows how it could have taken so long. But then my dad arrived and Mum and Dad swapped seats. And I will never forget till my dying day. That's a bit hyperbole because, as I say, I haven't thought about it in a long time. But Dad came in. He still had his briefcase with him. He'd come straight from the office. And Dad just said, "Thanks a lot, son." Even now, you can probably tell from my voice. I lost him in 2012, which is probably part of this. But even now, I feel crushed telling you that. Crushed. Thanks a lot, son. And then, obviously, I signed my statement. It was all recorded. I went through the details. I confessed to everything. I didn't have an Aladdin's cave at home or anything like that. And Dad drove me home. And I spent the rest of the summer holiday waiting to hear whether or not I was going to be, whether the case was going to be progressed, whether or not I was going to go to court, be prosecuted is the technical term, isn't it? Whether or not I was going to be prosecuted as a 15-year-old boy. And I remember taking the call from the station about a week or two before I was due to go back to school, and they told me that I was getting something called, I think, a conditional discharge. And I wasn't going to be. And I had to go into the police station to get it, again with my dad, and sit down with an inspector and get what do they call it? Read the rule book. And I remember saying on the phone, making me laugh with your messages, could we have a confession of a crime every day, please, James? I remember saying on the phone when they rang me to tell me that I had to come in for a conditional discharge. Do you remember the words I said? I said, I'm terribly sorry, sir. Does that mean that it's all over now? And he said, yes, it is. This is the end of the process. There won't, because I'd spent the whole summer in a state of absolute turmoil. And I've never stolen anything since, except the kids' biscuits. And that was in 1987 in the United Kingdom, in a country where now we routinely hear about people walking into shops with a sense of complete impunity, filling their boots with all manner of goods, including things like butter these days, and waltzing straight back out again without any fear whatsoever of being collared, punished, or curtailed in any way at all. And I just want today to work out what's changed and why. It's not a case of in my day-itis. It's not a plaintive call for nostalgic recollection. It's just incredible to reflect that we have essentially the same police service. We have the same laws. We have the same relationship between right and wrong. We speak the same language. We go to the same schools. And yet, that was among the most terrifying experiences of my life, and the most formative, and a word that's been used quite a lot in the news this week. It was a caution I got, not a conditional discharge, sorry. It was a caution, a police caution. So you have to be in court to get a conditional discharge. It was a police caution. And that was, even now, there were moments in telling you that story there where my blood ran cold, particularly, as I'm sure you could tell the bit, when my dad came into the room. And that's just mad when you look at what would happen today. There's a first-person account in the Times today from a fellow who runs a hardware store on East Road in Cambridge. For every item stolen from our store, we need to sell, on average, 12 of those same items simply to get it back. I'll share more details of that with you in a minute. But there's a gang of 12 people who specialise in stealing power tools. This fellow has got a map of where the stolen goods have been taken, and they can sort of almost work out where the gang is going. The police have got their addresses and do nothing. I'm not blaming the police, not to start with, because no one's joined the police service to stand idly by when crimes are being committed. But what on earth has changed? How has this changed? How have we changed from a country in which a 15-year-old boy could have his wits scared out of him by an arrest and a process of law and order for the relatively low-level crime of nicking 5 LP records from Woolworths, to a place where shoplifting has become so endemic and so ordinary that the idea of anybody getting into trouble for it at all has suddenly become almost unthinkable. Hit the numbers now. You will get through. All right. I don't want your stories. I don't want to sound ungrateful. I want answers to the question of how this has happened. What has changed? Give me a jigsaw piece and we'll put them all together to get a picture of how we could have changed. Admittedly, in quite a long period of time, it's made me feel quite old reflecting upon that. But still, in the course of my lifetime, things have gone, unrecognisably wrong. And I want to work out why. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. All right? How have things gone so utterly and completely wrong when, for good or for ill, the system used to work like a charm? It's 20 past 10. 22 minutes after 10 is the time. And it is a profound and probably lasting change that we are detailing, or at least seeking to describe this morning. And there will be a million different answers to the questions of how things have changed so completely and almost entirely for the worse. But I want to assemble them, and I need your help in doing so. How have we gone from a place where a kid caught shoplifting could have the fear of God put into him by a police service to a place where people who are shoplifting have next to no fear at all of being caught, never mind being punished? It's 22 minutes after 10 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Vinny's been in touch to say you should have gone down for that, James. I always knew that you were a wrong 'un. Also on the programme today, just while we wait to get the calls up, we'll be, there's quite a few things to look at. I've got a very nice unhinged headline for you. You'll never guess whose house is on the market, with a rather curious marketing campaign. And just 40% of children report feeling safe at school. Let's start with Simon in Kingston. What's changed, Simon?
Well, some things have changed and some things haven't. Back in the 80s, I was going out with a girl who lived in Clapham, and there were kids around there who were just rife. They knew they couldn't be done by the police. So they would just steal. Back in those days, they used to steal sort of stereos out of cars a lot. When they were sort of interchangeable. And also they used to break into houses. They used to kick the doors open, wide open. A gang of kids, sort of 6-8 kids, would go in, rush the house, steal loads of stuff, and then rush out again. We all had 30, 40 arrests against each of their names.
Just to remind you that we're talking about shoplifting. And the fact that there are now 430,104 offences that we know about, compared to a relatively tiny number 21 years ago, and compared to 37 years ago, where even if you were a teenage boy getting caught doing it, you would feel the full force of the law come down upon you. So if I just steer you back into the conversation that we're actually having.
Accepted, right. So anyway, my point, that first point was just to say it had been going on beforehand. The difference, I think, nowadays is social media.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, but social media has allowed everybody, and unfortunately, my son, we took my son to the shops the other day because he'd been caught stealing. Oh, so we took him back to the shop. So everybody knows the rules now that you can steal stuff and you're not going to get caught, you're not going to be arrested by the police, and you can steal up to a certain value. And it basically just gives people carte blanche. Yeah, but this
is chicken and egg. I'm asking where the carte blanche has come from rather than what the consequences of the carte blanche are. So do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I think it's the police were just too busy, and they're just saying we haven't got time to deal with these petty crimes, and we're just going to write them off. And by writing them off, it just means then.
Do we know what the numbers are for beat officer, if you like, versus population? The per capita policing figures, because we know 10,000 got lost during austerity, and they claim that 10,000 more have been signed up. It just feels as if they had time to deal with shoplifting, and you're suggesting that now they don't. And that might not be down to numbers. That might be down to cuts in all the other areas, like mental health provision, that police now find themselves having to paper over. I don't know. We don't know. We need a police officer to tell us, really.
Indeed. But I feel also that police, back in the day, you didn't have such a huge terrorism site. So maybe, I wouldn't be surprised if
Mate, this was the heyday of the IRA. The Birmingham pub bombings had taken place just up the road from where I'm describing. And a few years before, the paperboy, it's not a terrorism offence, but the paperboy Cole Bridgewater had been murdered. So I'm afraid your spectacles are a bit rose-tinted on that one. What happened when you took your lad back to the shop, just out of interest?
Right, so he got caught by camera, and then because he was in his school uniform, the shop contacted the school. So we then got contact about the school. So what we did, we took my son, my ex-wife and myself. We took my son down to the shop in whatever it was. I won't say where it is.
No, go on.
And we basically dragged him before the shop manager and made him apologise. We made him write a letter first of all. So he had a letter with him. So he handed it over.
How old is he?
He's 16. He's just 16.
And do you think this worked?
Yes, I think by us being there, as you said, that shame of involving his parents, etc. Hopefully, will make some difference.
And was this plan formed in conjunction with the school? Was this a sort of double?
No. This was us. This was us that just did it on our own. The school wanted to suspend him, but they seemed to think there'd been sort of multiple occasions, whereas the shop said he wasn't. So we ended up having a discussion with the school. But the whole point was to shame him in front of the.
And the police aren't involved at all.
Not at all. Not even a whisper.
Isn't that interesting?
But it was under £10.
Just out of curiosity, Simon, what did he nick?
Sandwiches and a fizzy drink. The usual sort of rubbish stuff.
Just why would I pay for it? And I can keep my money in my pocket. Thank you, Simon. Dave's in Caterham. Dave, what's changed?
Well, I was a police officer from late 90s.
I'll tell you what I'll be a Ray Liotta today, Dave. If the copper that arrested me rings in, not that he'd have any way of remembering or knowing who I was at the time, but some of the details of that tale might have rung a few bells. He'll be straight on the Ray Liotta roster. Go on. Sorry to interrupt. You were in the force.
That's all right. And the policing now, you picked up on it, and I don't think you realised. When I joined the job, it was a police force. It's now referred to as a police service.
Yeah, I did realise that, and I kind of hoped that no one would do what you're about to do. So explain to me how that changing semantics means that you don't get arrested for shoplifting anymore.
Because we're now seen by the politicians. That's all when it started to become a real political football.
So what are they doing instead then? So you're all sitting around now going, God, I wish we were out catching shoplifters, but we can't because we're called a police service now, not a police force.
Well, they're stuck with so much paperwork, but
that's got nothing to do with what the word is, has it, with force or service?
It is, because we're now having to record everything that we do, so the service is proven. So we can prove that we are providing the service.
Yeah, but you need to record everything that you do because we're talking about an era when people were routinely pushed downstairs.
Well, unfortunately...
430,104 offences, up 37% on last year. And guess what it was called last year, Dave?
What's that?
The police service. So why has it gone up 37% in the last 12 months?
There's loads of societal reasons. The cost of living and all stuff like this, that comes into it, obviously. I really have a concentration on the police because of my history. So if we don't have the police officers, if the police officers don't have the time to go and deal with this, and it's been happening for a long time, then the people that are suffering, the business owners, won't even call.
Which is why the 430,104 offences quite possibly doesn't even touch the side of the reality. With respect, Dave, and with gratitude for your service, the redefining of a police force into a police service has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with the number of shoplifting offences going unremarked and unsolved, if that's even a word, or unpunished. 10:30 is the time. Amelia Cox has the headlines. It is 10:33. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I don't know. Probably because I went quite deep emotionally at the top of the show today. But I was going to put you in Idiot's Corner, Richard, but it's a perfectly innocent mistake that you've made. Why are we complaining that we caught 37% more shoplifters? Of course, it could be that there are more people committing the crimes, but isn't it possible that rather than suggest the police are worse than before, they could actually be better? Mate, it's the number of offences recorded in England and Wales last year that's up 37%. The number of offenders that are caught has absolutely nothing to do with the figures that I've been reading out. In fact, rather than berating you for misunderstanding, I should probably apologise for not having made that clear enough. And I mean, the anecdotal evidence and indeed the evidential evidence, the recorded evidence of just how much impunity people operate with now is off the charts. And nobody denies that the problem has increased exponentially, has spiked in the most extraordinary fashion. The number of charges has indeed risen by 46% in the last year, but the number of recorded incidents has shot up exponentially. So what has changed from the days when I, as a relatively nice 15-year-old, had the fear of God put into him as a consequence of being caught shoplifting? Graham's in Macclesfield. Graham, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello,
Hi. First of all, don't beat yourself up. I mean, all kids make mistakes. And
oh, bless you. I'm over it now, Graham. 37 years ago. But it was just the memory of my...
Like it,
but that, only when my dad walked in, mate. And it's only when I think of what it must... As a parent, now... Yeah. Obviously, I wasn't then, but now the only bits where it got me was... But it's how kind of you to say that. Yeah. Thank you, but don't worry, I'm all right.
Yeah. Just to sort of give you a background. Yeah. I'm a retired magistrate.
Okay.
I first began sitting on the bench in 2006, and it was a different world even then.
Yes.
I mean, these numbers are astonishing. I mean, truly astonishing. But I mean, the first point is that at that time and throughout my career as a magistrate, the default conviction, if you like, for a first offence of theft was a conditional discharge.
Yeah.
You didn't.
That's if it got to you. There'd be plenty of people who got a caution for me as well.
Yeah, absolutely. But back then, I mean, between 2006, I would say, to when I retired in 2018, or just by 2018, most people who were committing shoplifting that got before the courts anyway were doing it to feed a drug habit.
Right.
So they were stealing to resell, to pay for their daily fix.
Yeah.
And the vast majority was that. By 2016, we're starting to see people coming in to court who have been caught shoplifting with items of groceries, usually meat or... Yeah. And in those cases, they were actually doing it to feed the families. And I remember having a conversation with our local MP, a guy called David Rutley, God help us.
Yeah.
And
he's not here to defend himself, Graham.
No, he's swanning around the Caribbean doing trade deals.
Go on.
And he happened to have he was on one of his photo op visits and visited the court. And he said to me, Graham, tell me how things changed. I said, well, the big change is in shoplifting. I said, people are now stealing to feed the families rather than feed a drug habit.
Right.
And his answer was, well, I don't really understand that because we've got plenty of food banks.
Oh, Lord. He's not here to defend himself. So I've got no reason to doubt what you're telling me. And I need to steer you, as I did with an earlier caller, a little bit back to the... And if you had to point to one or two major reasons why we've gone from the scenario you described, the scenario I described a few years previously, to the scenario that we're all living with today.
It's policy. It's government policy.
Really?
The justice system has been stripped back to bones and beyond. Hundreds of magistrates' courts have been closed. Court time is unavailable. God knows how Rishi's found court time to deal with the immigrants, but that's another story.
It is.
The whole justice system has been stripped back.
So we're talking about austerity then?
Basically, yeah.
Since 2010. The police numbers and court systems. I saw the secret barrister tweeting the other day about a case he's got that isn't going to come to court for years. And I think it was a rape case, but he was making the same point you were making about these special Rwandan court. So we shouldn't. I mean, in fact, in a way, it's naive to sit here slapping our foreheads going, what the heck has happened? It's actually quite straightforward. The system that I described, I could easily have ended up in court back in 1987. I could have ended up in front of somebody like you, but I won't. I won't now, because the pipes of justice haven't just been clogged, they've been dismantled.
They've been dismantled, yeah. And so what's happened is that the government has effectively transferred the responsibility to ordinary people, to shoplift.
To what we just heard, to the dad in Kingston, to Simon in Kingston, trotting his 16-year-old son back to the shop, or the shopkeeper taking the CCTV to the school and not bothering with getting the police involved. Graham, thank you. I'm cracking on only because there's a lot of calls, but that's really significant. I think it is. And listen, one retired magistrate does not a summer make, but he knows what he's talking about, and that. I mean, it may have been bleeding obvious to you all along, but actually wondering what's gone wrong with the framework is possibly a luxury we don't get to enjoy in this country at this time, because the framework isn't there. So it's not a question of what's happened. We used to turn that knob and then the water would come out of that pipe. But actually the pipes aren't there anymore. So you can turn that knob, but if you're expecting anything to happen, then I've got a bridge to sell you. Mike's in Preston. Mike, what would you like to say?
Hi, morning, James.
Hello, Mike.
Hi. I've owned a convenience store in Preston since 2002. Okay. Back in the day, we had a local NIC, which we no longer have. Everything's been centralised into one NIC in Preston. And we had 3 community support officers committed to our area and a beat bobby. So if we had a problem, I could have somebody at the store within an hour. And because these community support officers were in that area, they got to know everything. They knew where everybody lived, everything that was going on. And if it was anybody local, they pretty much had a fix on who it was, and they could get there and just nip it in the bud.
It's literally community policing, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, on one occasion, I think it was 2008, we had somebody had stolen something, just one, a bottle of cider or something like that. Give them a call. They came down. They were looking at the CCTV. Yeah. Their officer was there, and he phoned it through. Oh, we know this guy. He said, we've actually got him in the nick for something else. We'll throw this at him at the same time. Yeah. Now, at the moment... So this
is only 20 years ago?
No, that was about 2008. When the Tories came in and made the cuts, and they decided to cut the police. We had a Bobby used to come in the shop, and he said, they've just ruined my career. They said, what's happened? There's a lot of ambitious superintendents out there have told, have said, we can get crime down. Effectively, these were his words, by not reporting it. And everything just got centralised, and we lost the boots on the ground, and they were so important.
So you would track this back to 2010 and the introduction of Theresa May in the Home Office a couple of years later, and speaking to the Police Federation just up the road from where you are in Preston, and telling them to stop scaremongering about cuts in policing having an effect upon crime rates, and indeed the Community Police Officer of the Year addressing her directly about the damage she was doing.
Absolutely. I mean, at the moment, we've got, and it is somebody that we think that is has got a drug habit. Right. I think it was on Tuesday. I wasn't in the store at that time, but she came in. She had a small shopping trolley, and she filled it full of household products. That could. The member of staff and a member of the customers managed to grab that back off her outside and got it back in. Yeah. Added up to about 50 odd quid, and she said, I didn't steal it from you, I stole it from somebody else. Oh, but I can't get anybody to come down to look at it.
So what do you do, Mike? What do you do?
Oh, we'll report it online. Yeah. I stopped a local Bobby in the street the other day I saw, and she gave me her email. Right. She asked me to email some footage through. I emailed that through. It just bounced back at me. It wouldn't accept the file. And so we do the reporting on the local police, Lancashire Police.
And website.
And if you get about 3 or 4 or 5, you get a phone call. It's nothing like it used to be. So now we're in the position of trying to find out where this lady lives, because she's been in a couple of times taking stuff, and then you run the risk of what happens if there's a confrontation or anything like that. I mean, all we can do is catch her in the act and stop her from coming in.
So you want to know where she lives so that you can tell the police?
Yes, exactly.
Just to be clear, you're not heading around there like Edward Woodward.
Yeah, and No. You've been tempted a few,
Of course you have. Of course you have. So this is the best illustration yet of what it's like at the coalface. Some people may not like the political angle that you've brought to proceedings.
This isn't political, James. This is just a 100% fact what happened.
No, all I mean by that is dating it to the change in government. But I would tell them to sling their hook, because you're describing it absolutely from the first-hand perspective. So when people like James cleverly start saying things like, shoplifting had a corrosive effect on public confidence, a lack of confidence to be able to live your full life is really important. So when people see videos of shops being robbed, it has a corrosive effect. We have to deal with it. He is once again describing problems for which his party bears a huge amount of responsibility.
Yeah, well, we've got the fruit of their actions, haven't we? We've seen it, and it's these community support officers. It wasn't just helping us with shoplifting; it was drugs, people selling drugs in the area and stuff like that. I don't want to go off piece for you.
No, you're not going off piece, because in fact, I'm going to dig out that speech from the. It was the Community Police Officer of the Year speaking at a Police Federation conference when. So I used to play it a lot, I think, before Brexit, when we could talk about other things. But you're not going off piece, because he would have known people. And if it was me, he'd know my mum and dad. So if you'd said that Jim O'Brien's lad from number 97 was nicking, so he got away, he'd come round and knock on our door and have a word and say, your boy's been nicking from Mike's shop. That's what community policing sounds like, right?
It was brilliant, and a lot of people call them plastic cops. I found them absolutely fantastic.
But there's two types. You're talking about the PCSOs. I'm talking about the community police officers who would be fully on the
you got those, and they were supported by the PCSOs.
Exactly right,
and they form a brilliant team.
Oh boy! So, can you remember the moment? I mean, I did this. You might not have clocked it at the time, but when you go from knowing that you'd have the full support of a big system, and that the capture, for want of a better word, of the culprit would be more likely than not, to the point where you first realised, I'm not even sure it's worth phoning this one in.
Oh, it was sometime 2012 afterwards. Just when they closed the local police station, then we had no chance. Trying to get through, to the centralised police station in Preston. It's just impossible. You're just going through.
It's that simple. It really is that simple. For you to date it, to pinpoint it.
Yeah, and I've got to emphasise it's not just shoplifting; it's everything else that goes on in the area.
No, of course it is. Everything that would have once come under the remit of the community police officer. Mike, thank you. 10:46 is the time. Lynn's in a similar field, although she manages a charity shop rather than a convenience store. She says, we don't call the police anymore, James, for thefts or for antisocial behaviour, because they won't come. I've had to stop caring so much because it eats you up to put something nice on the shop floor and then to see it missing without a sale. That's a beautiful turn of phrase you got there, Lynn, because that you're talking about your mental health. It eats you up. You could, and if you've got the added dimension of knowing that it's eating into your income, it's the wages you pay, it's your own income, like it is for Mike. Lynn, you're a wonderful person, but you don't. If the stuff that gets nicked doesn't essentially come out of your own pocket, it just deprives the people that you're trying to fundraise for of help. But both of those things are going to take a huge toll on you if you let them. And sometimes, of course, you don't have any choice about letting them. So it's a good thing in a way that you've managed to care less about theft. So many different dimensions to this. I thought there would be, but I think I may have underestimated just how many. It's 10 to 11. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. His name was Damien O'Reilly, Inspector Damien O'Reilly, and I think he'd just picked up Community Police Officer of the Year, or he'd recently been awarded Community Police Officer of the Year, and he was talking about his decision, I think, to leave the job, to redeploy. Anyway, let's find out if my memory is as full of holes as it sometimes seems to be.
Damien O'Reilly, Greater Manchester Police. Home Secretary, you'll remember in November 2010 you presented me with Community Police Officer of the Year award. I say that at conference, forgive me, just to show that I do know what I'm talking about. Unfortunately, I'd worked in inner city Manchester for 15 years. I felt passionate about what I was doing. In 2012, I had to leave. I couldn't take it anymore, because the changes that have been imposed have caused community policing to collapse. That's the reality, man. Intelligence has dried up. There aren't local officers. They don't know what's happening. They're all reactive. There's no proactive policing locally. That is the reality, man. And Mark Rowley just mentioned neighbourhood policing was critical to dealing with terrorism. We run the risk here of letting communities down, putting officers at risk, and ultimately risking national security. I'd ask you to seriously reconsider the budget and the level of cuts over the next 5 years.
It's a good job I didn't play that at the beginning of the hour, isn't it? Because it might have knocked all of the stuffing out of the phone in. I mean, that is extraordinary. It's particularly extraordinary. I do this thing. Terry Wogan was always very good at this. Always very good at remembering that you might not be paying full attention to what is actually going on the radio at the moment. You know, we aspire to be, at best, a bit of background noise or background company. But I wonder how many people felt the same shiver I felt when he dated it, if you were listening to what Mike in Preston had to say just a few minutes ago. I may even remind you of what Mike in Preston had to say just a couple of minutes ago, because it tallies so completely with what Inspector Damien O'Reilly just said, and makes such a mockery of Theresa May's Tory successor in the Home Office, James Cleverly, wringing his hands and clutching his pearls and making all the right noises about people seeing videos of shops being robbed. The argument that it's not a direct consequence of policies introduced by his own governments becomes almost impossible to sustain. So you just heard Damien O'Reilly talk about having to leave the job in 2012 because the cuts and the changes to the way the job is done were robbing him of the ability to do his duty. And literally the previous call was Mike in Preston, but previous call but one maybe? Or no, the previous call I think was Mike in Preston, who runs a convenience store just down the road from where Damien O'Reilly used to do his job as a former community police officer of the year. So what happened between 2010 and 2012? Yeah, and here is Mike in Preston. This is the shiver moment. To the point where you first realised, I'm not even sure it's worth phoning this one in.
Oh, it was sometime 2012 afterwards. Just when they closed the local police station, then we had no chance. Trying to get through, to the centralised police station in Preston. It's just impossible. You're just going through.
It's that simple. It really is that simple. It really is that simple. I mean, it probably isn't. Can't trust that fella on the radio, honestly. But a bit mad, right? That happened in because I didn't remember what exactly was in that clip from Damien O'Reilly's contribution. And I'll tell you something else that'll send a shiver down your spine. The Manchester Arena terrorist was in the neighbouring patch, the neighbouring beat to the one that Damien O'Reilly used to pound. And the argument that if someone was demonstrating signs of potential criminality or just seemed to be dodgy or something that would concern a local police officer, that would have been. That's why he talked about national security. Don't miss that point. We're talking about shoplifting. That's why he talked about national security. If something appeared to be fermenting on your patch, you would try to be across it. And it was on the neighbouring patch that the Manchester, the man, I use the word advisedly, the creature that went on to bomb the Manchester Arena at that Ariana Grande concert was at the time on the neighbouring patch from where the community officers, under the analysis of the former community officer of the year, were being removed and prevented from doing their jobs. So what did you expect, you might say, if you had the opportunity to interview Theresa May? Back to the phones. Sam's in Basildon. Sam, what would you like to say?
Yeah, it was coming back to the statistics you had in relation to how many shoplifters that are going on now. I'd hope, police officers do a really difficult job and they try and do their best for the public, and it's really difficult listening to members of the public who've had a poor service. PCs and sergeants on the front line really want to give that service they can, but when you're looking at the total numbers, I want people to sort of realise it's a very small amount of people that commit a lot of crime. And sadly, I've been witness to this for tens of years now. It's the same names, it's the same faces doing the same things, and sadly, when you're looking at sentencing, it's very difficult. You want to get to the crux of why people do commit crime. What can you do to help them? What interventions can you put in place? Where is the help and support locally to prevent this from happening? But some people are so entrenched that it's just a repetitive circle for them. And
but I think with respect, that as you say, you've been doing it for tens of years, that would not explain the exponential increase, would it? If it's the same people doing the same thing that they've been doing in the same ways for years, we wouldn't be watching an explosion in the actual events that are under discussion today. And also, I have to remind you that means that the old way of handling things didn't work either, because they're still doing it now. So I again, with respect, there's clearly an exponential rise, not only in the number of crimes, but in the number and type of person doing it. For example, the organised crime element, where people are stealing huge amounts of food to sell on. That didn't used to happen on anything like the scale that it's happening now.
Yeah, there are different types. When you're looking back in the day, it may have been, we didn't have these organised crime groups that come out and target shops and steal thousands of pounds of food, alcohol, etc. But you do also get types of people who move away from, say, burglaries and realise, actually,
there's more money in this, and it's safer. It's safer work. Exactly. That rings true.
There's less sentence as well. There's less sentence at the end of it, but it is a really difficult job. You see the same offenders coming in and out, and you're looking at the sentencing. The sentencing is, suspended sentence, a short sentence, and then you have things like the early release.
But again, I don't want to sound repetitive, but that was always the case. It's odd, isn't it? It's the people who aren't getting close to the justice system that seem to be the growth area. Just quickly, if you mentioned that you're a police officer, where do you go? Where do things like butter get sold? Because I remember being stunned when I first moved to Ladbroke Grove in West London, that my local supermarket had alarms on the meat. I'd seen them on the vodka before, or on razor blades, but I'd never seen. They're on everything now in some supermarkets. They're literally on everything. So and you'd be sitting in the pub and someone would offer you some Gillette Mac 3s or a packet of smoked salmon or something like that. But now they're stealing everything. Where do you buy stolen butter?
No doubt that sort of thing still happens. People will have their favourite place where they'll go. They'll have handlers who they'll go to regularly and sell items like this. And
then someone goes door to door with it? So, or because there's no margin, is there? The dynamics are different from normal capitalism, because I've got no overheads apart from whatever it is I pay the thief, which will be tuppence halfpenny, and then I sell it to you for £2. That's a £1.50 profit straight away on a slab of butter, which is more than any supermarket could ever take. But do they go door to door with a chill bag, or do I go to a sort of illegal shop? Do you know? You might not know. I'm just intrigued.
I've never come across somebody going door to door selling it.
No. Well, I may add that it's 11 o'clock already, but I meant to ask that, but I think I got a bit carried away. I may have been a bit short with the first two callers as well, for which I apologise, because I got a bit taken by surprise by how emotional I got when I remembered how crushing it was to let mum and dad down in such a spectacular fashion, and that must be part of it. That must. I don't know. What that 16-year-old lad Simon talked about. He probably feels like I felt about it, but it's a different world, isn't it, that people like Sam have to police. Although I have to say, the text that just came in now saying, don't be too hard on yourself, says Darryl. At least you didn't get Rwanda mixed up with the Congo, on which more shortly. It's 4 minutes after 11 and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. This will be the politics hour, both domestic and international, I think, although the last hour became that was pretty notable, wasn't it? That pinpointing of dates. And remember who was Prime Minister in 2012 when the mad rush towards shoplifting, hitting its highest level in at least 20 years, began. It was David Cameron, who gets rewarded by Rishi Sunak with both a seat in the House of Lords and a job as Foreign Secretary. So corrupt is the ecosystem in which these people flourish. But one of the and we're going to have a look at a couple of other political issues this hour as well. We'll catch up with our Scottish editor Gina Davidson on what on earth is going on in the Scottish Parliament, with Humza Yousaf apparently undertaking an extraordinary act of sabotage. And there was a caller on Nick earlier today, I don't know if you heard it, drawing attention to an interview on Hard Talk, which is the BBC World Service's interview programme, pointing out, or rather, I think one of the senior people from the United Nations Supreme Court pointing out a misunderstanding in how some of the media, myself included, LBC included, have covered that finding about genocide and plausibility in The Hague. So I want to clear that up as well, because if you cover the Middle East, if you cover the situation in Israel and Gaza with an absolute commitment to objectivity and facts, then the single most important thing you have to do is clarify and correct whenever the circumstances seem to change, regardless of what the story is or what the changing facts may be. What you can't do is go down the road of some of the contributors to the public discourse, who of course end up even getting fired as official spokesmen for having a slightly strained relationship with the truth. So we need to have another look at that as well, which we will do, and also catch up with the developing story on the mass graves that have been found in the grounds of 2 hospitals in Gaza, 6 minutes after 11. So all that to come this hour. I'm going to begin, as is becoming traditional, or at least I've done it for 2 or 3 days running now, with a joke that you have sent in at the top of a topic, which is much funnier than anything I can come up with. Alan Jones has already used WhatsApp to send this message to the studio. Umbongo, they drink it in Rwanda, apparently, which is a reference to an extraordinary act of incompetence by the policing and former immigration minister, Chris Philp, on Question Time last night, which I think you really need to hear in its entirety. It would be literally impossible to defend this in any way or to question the sheer scale of the humiliation Chris Philp heaps upon himself here. You might as well just tattoo client journalist across your forehead if you're going to pretend that this is anything other than deeply, deeply shameful.
Chris, I come from a neighbouring country called Congo, if you know geographically, that is located right next door to Rwanda. And right now in Goma, there's a genocide going on, and there's such a big conflict going on with people from Rwanda. So had my family members come from Goma on a crossing right now, would they then be sent back to the country that they're supposedly warring, Rwanda? Does that make any sense to you?
No, I think there's an exclusion on people from Rwanda being sent to Rwanda.
They're not from Rwanda, they're from Congo.
They're from Congo.
And they're supposedly
Okay.
warring these people from Rwanda. Are they then going to be sent to Rwanda if they came here on a crossing?
From
Congo? Yeah.
Would people be sent from... Well, I mean, Rwanda is a different country of Congo, isn't it? It's a different country.
Yes.
It is.
Yes. So you're saying if they come from a war zone in Congo, would they then be sent to Rwanda? That's
Well,
the point he's making.
so there is a clause in the legislation that says if somebody would suffer, I think the phrase is serious and irreversible harm by being sent somewhere, they wouldn't be sent. So there is that safety mechanism built into the legislation.
There isn't. Apart from not knowing that Rwanda and Congo are 2 different countries, there isn't the thing that he describes, not with reference to people from Congo. A Congolese person could easily be sent to Rwanda if they met illegal, irregular arrival conditions. So if they'd come over in a small boat, then they would indeed be susceptible for deportation to Rwanda. The nationality or group identity would simply not meet that exception for particular individual circumstances. I'm going to play you that again. It's one of those mornings where I know this is really significant and important, and I know it's a phone-in, but I can't quite find my way into the phone-in. So feel free to text or suggest ways in which we might do it. But this is absolutely shameful. It's not just some random who's popped up on Question Time. It's not some Herbert from a think tank who seem to have season tickets for BBC discussion programmes, despite nobody knowing who pays their wages. It's not some headbanging columnist from the Daily Telegraph, which reminds me today's unhinged headline actually comes from the Daily Mail. I thought we'd mix it up a little. It's not a classic, I've got to be honest with you, but I thought we'd try and keep the flag flying for the unhinged headline. It's not some sort of junior politician or a populist wannabe demagogue like Farage, all of whom you would expect not to have a full grasp of the facts. It's a man who, until relatively recently, had responsibility for immigration as a member of His Majesty's government, a minister with some responsibility for immigration. He now has responsibility for policing. So just listen again to this. I'm going to use the word for the second time today. this extraordinary level of ignorance, because it's breathtaking.
Chris, I come from a neighbouring country called Congo, if you know geographically, that is located right next door to Rwanda. And right now in Goma, there's a genocide going on, and there's such a big conflict going on with people from Rwanda. So had my family members come from Goma on a crossing right now, would they then be sent back to the country that they're supposedly warring, Rwanda? Does that make any sense to you?
No, I think there's an exclusion on people from Rwanda being sent to Rwanda.
They're not from Rwanda, they're from Congo.
They're from Congo.
And they're supposedly
Okay.
warring these people from Rwanda. Are they then going to be sent to Rwanda if they came here on a crossing?
From
Congo? Yeah.
Would people be sent from... Well, I mean, Rwanda is a different country of Congo, isn't it? It's a different country.
Yes.
It is.
Yes. Definitely. So you're saying if they come from the war zone in Congo, would they then be sent to Rwanda? That's
Well,
the point he's making.
so there is a clause in the legislation that says if somebody would suffer, I think the phrase is serious and irreversible harm by being sent somewhere, they wouldn't be sent. So there is that safety mechanism built into the legislation.
So Ian Duncan Smith, the former leader of the Conservative Party, toured the studios not long ago, shortly after the Rwandan debacle first reared its ridiculous head, claiming that if your application was successful, you'd be brought back from Kigali to the United Kingdom. That was completely wrong. That was completely wrong. What Chris Philp just said about exemptions from deportation for people from Congo was completely wrong. Do you remember the story I told you from, I think, 2018 about refugees in Rwanda being shot dead after protesting against their food rations? I told you the story a few times. Guess where they were from? The refugees shot by Rwandan authorities in 2018. Yeah, they were Congolese, those refugees. Imagine that. Imagine getting out of a war zone, getting to the UK, and then being deported back to a country that was part of the war that you'd fled and responsible for killing your countrymen just 6 years ago. There's a reason why they have to pass laws to claim that Rwanda is safe when it isn't. I think the biggest red herring I've heard in the context of this policy is the observation that the United Nations send some refugees to Rwanda as well. Those are people who either stay in Libya or go to Rwanda. So the United Nations takes the view that putting them in Rwanda is preferable to leaving them in Libya. Anybody attempting to use that as a defence of sending genuine asylum seekers, genuine refugees who've made their way to the UK as acceptable is either deliberately misleading you or not bothering to understand the most basic of facts. And speaking of not bothering to understand the most basic of facts, someone's just texting me to say that a close ally of Chris Philp is claiming that the question was rhetorical, which you simply could not sustain for a nanosecond if you watched the faces of the people engaged in that exchange, including Fiona Bruce, who answers in good faith the question that had already been answered by the fellow who asked the original question when he talked about the two different countries. So how do we do this as a phone-in? I think I'm going to ask you a question that you could perhaps describe as rhetorical, but it's not rhetorical. I don't think any of them really know what this policy does. I first thought this when Ian Duncan Smith, and how many times have you heard, apart from me, how many times have you heard Ian Duncan Smith be reminded of the fact that he was supporting a policy without knowing what it was? Without knowing what it was. How many times do you hear it properly pointed out that the documents that were signed include reciprocal arrangements for asylum seekers who've made their way to Rwanda to be relocated to the United Kingdom? Now, it does get mentioned occasionally, but I don't know. Let's find out, and if it doesn't work, I'll find another way into it. And maybe you've got more evidence than I've managed to muster up at the moment, but they don't actually know what the policy is. And I don't think it matters in the minds of people that support it or in the minds of the people that are promoting it. I honestly think that Johnson set the bar so low, let's just announce something that makes it feel like we're being horrible to refugees. And everyone else is just joining in. I don't think they know what the policy is. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need to tell me whether or not you do. So that there are two questions here. Do you think they know what the policy is? Genuinely, do you think they know what the policy is? And then the second question is, and in a way this is what my whole new book is about, but I'd rather hear your answers to this question today. How can somebody so obviously, I mean, you remember when Laura Trott didn't know what GDP was or didn't know what... do you know what I'm fighting? I'm fighting the urge to say, why aren't we more shocked by this than we should be? So I'm not going to resist that question. Why are we not more shocked by this than we should be? Maybe you are shocked by it. But how on earth can you have an immigration minister, a former immigration minister, a recent immigration minister, sitting on the BBC's flagship political discussion programme, Question Time, revealing levels of ignorance that stretch your credulity, levels of ignorance and incompetence that would make you question whether or not he would be permitted to run a bath, and yet his position will be completely untouched. Just as Laura Trott, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, went on the PM programme with Evan Davis and revealed that she didn't understand the figures that were actually in front of her. She didn't understand the relationship between GDP and growth, between GDP and debt. It was possible, listening to that interview, that she didn't even understand what percentages were. You've got a generation of government politicians here, government-level politicians, not sort of eccentric backbenchers, but senior ministerial appointments, whose grasp of their own brief, not a neighbouring brief, not a brief they've never held, but whose grasp of their own brief is absolutely non-existent. But that's still not quite the right question, is it? How did this happen? We kind of know how it happened. Why aren't we more outraged? Because we're used to it? Because we're used to it? So, is this a policy? Is this a policy that has absolutely nothing to do with reality? Is it one of the first policies we've seen as a population that has absolutely nothing to do with reality? I could even ask whether it's Brexit 2.0. It's got absolutely nothing to do with what might actually be delivered, what might actually be feasible, what might actually be possible, and everything to do with the feelings, the emotions that it is designed to conjure up in the hearts and minds of a notional supporter. Because if I was a supporter of this policy at any point in the last 2 years, I wouldn't be a supporter of it now. Because they clearly don't know what they're... With Brexit, it didn't matter. Because Brexit was all about getting it over the line, getting it done, getting it oven ready. And then when it turned out to be absolutely ridiculous, most of the people responsible had either developed collective amnesia or disappeared over the horizon. This one is just such a weird piece of legislation. And the weirdest element of it seems to me to be that the people who are promoting it, supporting it and steering it through Parliament don't seem to understand what it actually is, what it does, what it's designed to achieve. Remember when Theresa May thought she'd got one over on Yvette Cooper because Yvette Cooper was talking about Kigali and not about Rwanda, and Theresa Coffey, apparently didn't realise that Kigali was the capital city of Rwanda. It's still not quite there. Is it possible? Is it possible that we have got a government that doesn't understand anything about its own flagship policy? 0345 60973 is the number that you need. I don't know how to really zone in on how dispiriting I find that little clip of Chris Philp and the smiling and the fact that nothing will happen. He'll move on. He'll probably get a slap on the back from his mates. What is the... All right, let's do it like this then. How can someone like that end up on Question Time? What is the level of entitlement and delusion about your own abilities that you need to think, yeah, I'll go on Question Time, I'll answer all the questions about Rwanda? Is it the same country as Congo? Maybe that's what we need to ask. How can somebody who knows so little think, yeah, I'm the one, I'm the chap? I've asked you about 43 questions in the last 13 minutes. You are now invited to answer any, none, or all of them by dialing 0345 6060 973. But this is gross. Not just the policy and the pretense that there's something ordinary or acceptable about changing the meaning of the word unsafe to safe in order to get it over the line, but the fact that none of the people in the media or the Conservative Party who profess to support the policy understand anything about it. How's that happened? Hit the numbers now. You will get through. It's not the first time I know this one's gone bonkers. It's absolutely not the case that this is the only corner of the British media pointing out how absolutely ridiculous that moment was. I don't know if you've seen the photographs. If you follow me on Twitter, there's an extraordinary shot of the Question Time audience at the moment where Chris Philp's trousers fell down, and the face palming of one of the people with the absolute. I mean, someone has tweeted that it should be in the National Gallery. And yet, you know that client journalists will be queuing up to claim, it's not as bad as everybody says it is. It's not that bad. We should send it to VAR or something. Maybe it was offside. Utterly. Eleanor's called it the second best photograph of the week. What was the best photograph of the week? The seagull. Was it? What? Oh, the horses. Crikey, of course the horses. The seagull was pretty good. Although that was footage rather than a still photograph. But if you follow me on Twitter, at Mr. James OB, you can have a look at that shot. Every single person in the audience knows exactly how humiliating that moment was for Chris Philp, but there are a few client journalists queuing up to pretend that they don't. How's this happened? How have we got to a place where a former immigration minister cannot understand the most basic contents of the only really major immigration policy that this government has? Barbara's in Havant. Barbara, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James. This is going to be a bit of a ramble. I'm not answering any particular question.
Well, you mean like the introduction, really, Barbara? So there you go. We're among friends.
Okay. Well, I can't tell you how grim how sad and ashamed I felt.
Yes.
On the morning, was it Tuesday morning, when we heard that this nasty piece of unimplementable legislation actually was passed in our parliament. Where do you start with Chris Philp? A man who had an immigration brief doesn't know the difference between that there are two countries, one the DRC and one the Rwanda. And by the way, Rwanda, this great safe country, is actually financing a war in Goma, where the question came. Where the
questioner came from,
exactly.
and referenced. He referenced precisely that.
Exactly. This man is completely ignorant, and someone who shouldn't be ignorant.
How can that not matter, Barbara? How can we have reached a point where it doesn't matter? Laura Trott, Chief Secretary to the Treasury, can completely humiliate herself on live radio. This bloke can go on television, and none of it matters. It mattered once. It did matter once, didn't it?
It did matter once. I don't know why it doesn't matter, and I find it quite shocking. I think one of the reasons is they've got away with it so far, and they will continue to get away with it. And my God, if I'm allowed to say that so early in the morning, if they get another 5 years, which all the polls suggest they might not, there will be no limits to what they will attempt to get away with. Their hubris will be unbounded. So beware who you vote for. We must get rid of these people. But they are so ignorant of everything. Have they ever sat down and spoken to refugees that have come to this country from Afghanistan, from Eritrea, from all over the world? Have they read the Freedom of Information request from the Home Office regarding the deportation of an Iraqi man, the plane that was stopped because of the intervention of the ECHR?
Yes.
Have they read that report?
Unlikely.
Which describes men screaming, shouting, begging for their lives?
Well, I think, it's a very good question that you asked, because here's what I think, and I hadn't crystallised this thought until you said that. I mean, I don't know how much time you spend on social media. I sense not a lot, Barbara. You sound far too sensible.
I don't spend an awful lot.
But there are people on social media who would profess relish for what you've just described. There were people on there who were celebrating the deaths of the 5 people in the English Channel earlier this week. And yes. I'm increasingly drawn to the slightly bonkers conclusion that those are the people that the party is wooing, but that they can't themselves, because they would feel soiled and ashamed to publicly admit that they were wooing people like this, but they're actually embarrassed that that's what they're reduced to. So there are people who go, I'm glad they were screaming, I'm glad that they're harming themselves, I'm glad that they're committing suicide, I'm glad that they're drowning in the English Channel. Social media is full of people like that, and they are the kind of people that perhaps are being leached off by parties or politicians even further to the right than the Tories. So I look at, we describe a vacuum, Barbara. There is a vacuum where Chris Philp's brain should be. And now we are speculating on what is in that space, what is in that vacuum. And that's one of the possibilities.
I guess that the whole Rwanda thing is an attempt to gain votes, but it is so sinister, because if that's what responsible government looks like, appealing to the very base.
The worst of the worst. You can have sensible conversations. You can be opposed to accepting refugees, but the kind of people who actually celebrate misery and celebrate heartache and heartbreak and death. I don't know. It's just one of the consequences you have when you have vacuums created in politics, is that you have no control whatsoever over what moves into the space available. Thank you, Barbara. There is a growing sense of crisis in Scotland, as you may be aware. Humza Yousaf, the First Minister, has pulled out of a scheduled public appearance today. We'll catch up with what is going on there, or at least what we think might be going on there, with Gina Davidson, LBC's political editor in Scotland, shortly after the very latest news. After that, Barbara and I both managing to have what I hope was a cogent and engaging conversation, despite somewhat lacking focus on anything other than Chris Philp's humiliation on Question Time last night, a minister who until recently had responsibility for immigration, revealing levels of ignorance with regard to his government's flagship immigration legislation that would, in normal circumstances, would it have been a resignation issue? I don't think anyone's ever resigned over something that happened on Question Time, have they? Well, one of the fellows from Farage's party was doing an interview the other day and talked about how he'd have been happy to watch people drown. He'd have been happy to watch Ben Habib, his name is. I see that he's put up some sort of clip claiming that was completely misrepresented. Unfortunately for him, we've all watched it. We've all heard the words come out of his mouth. It's like a sort of Harry Enfield sketch or something out of Little Britain. When until you remember that we're living in a country where the government can change the word safe or unsafe to mean safe. So, I mean, who can blame a fella from Farage's outfit for popping up and saying, when I said that I would be perfectly comfortable to watch refugees drown, I didn't mean that I would actually be perfectly comfortable watching refugees drown. You can't really criticise him for that when the actual government is saying, well, obviously, when the official investigators concluded that this country was unsafe, they actually meant it was safe, and we're going to pass a law to prove it. And that is the backdrop, perhaps, against which somebody like Chris Philp can rise to high office and humiliate himself on national television without any consequences or repercussions. Except this. This is it. This is the consequence. This is the repercussion. Here is Amelia Cox with your headlines. It is 11:33. Was it Ben or Chris? Someone suggested Ken Clarke may have got sacked for something that he said on Question Time with regard to Theresa May's nonsense, which, of course, probably still gets recycled by client journalists, about a fellow who avoided deportation because he had a cat. Ken Clarke pointing out that was a load of complete nonsense. And I know he got into trouble for that. That great paragon of virtue, our current Foreign Secretary David Cameron was Prime Minister at the time. But I don't know that it was. I need to check my notes to see whether or not it was indeed a Question Time moment. I'm only asking whether Question Time, anyone's ever said anything on Question Time, a politician has ever done anything on Question Time that subsequently got them sacked. Because if it was ever going to happen, it should really have happened last night with Chris Philp. But what's the likelihood of Rishi Sunak sacking someone for being rubbish and not knowing their brief and supporting the Rwanda bill despite not understanding what's in it? He'd have to sack the entire cabinet. But from Westminster to Holyrood, or at least to Scotland, where Humza Yousaf has pulled out of a scheduled public appearance amid growing crisis in his leadership, you're probably across most of the facts. Gina Davidson, LBC's political editor in Scotland, certainly is, and has been explaining the detail on this radio station pretty much since it happened. And what happened was that he essentially detached the SNP from the Greens in coalition, and appears to have been taken by surprise by what has happened subsequently, Gina. That's the bit I don't get. How can he be surprised by this?
Well, I think, James, he was not expecting the ferocity of their response to this. The Greens have worked in coalition in this cooperation agreement known as the Butte House Agreement since 2021. it all seems to have been reasonably amicable. There have been tensions growing in both parties amongst the membership about it. And, there were questions about how long it might last, if it would run until 2026. But there was certainly no indication until yesterday that Humza Yousaf had decided to terminate this arrangement. He had Patrick Harvey and Lorna Slater, the co-conveners, in to Butte House yesterday morning to tell them that. Now, they were furious about that. They were expecting to have a membership vote within the Scottish Greens about whether or not to stay in the Butte House agreement. That wasn't due to take place for another month, and they were pretty convinced that they could convince their members to remain in government rather than to walk away, because they were upset about climate change targets being dumped, about the cash report and the implications it might have for gender care in Scotland. So there were a number of big issues that they wanted to discuss and then have a vote on whether or not to remain. As I say, the Greens co-leaders in Holyrood thought they would be able to talk round the membership on that. But it looks like Humza Yousaf had decided that he wasn't going to wait for that. He wasn't going to let them make that decision for him. And he struck first. Now, I think as a result of that, the furious reaction from the Greens, particularly that because there's now going to be a vote of no confidence in the First Minister, that's been lodged by the Scottish Conservatives, and their decision to actually vote with the Conservatives on that, to vote against Humza Yousaf, has taken the Scottish Government aback somewhat. They were not expecting that. I mean, if you listen to Humza Yousaf in his press conference yesterday, he very much seemed to indicate that he believes, informal cooperation with the Greens would continue. That in terms of where they were in many places on policy, that would.
He was barking up the wrong tree on that. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I do want to get across some of the other things that are going on. It's been reported while you've been on air that he's considering his own position before the confidence vote and may actually resign. Is that going to be a question of numbers? If Ash Regan, who of course defected to Alex Salmond's outfit after losing the leadership battle to Humza Yousaf, if her intentions become clear on the Tory motion, which is a vote of no confidence in him personally, then he might jump before he's pushed.
Yeah, well, we're being told that is not going to happen, that he has no intention of resigning, that he's not even considering his position. Now, we know he's cancelled this event. He was due to speak at Strathclyde University today, laying out, another independence plan around the labour market. He's not doing that now, but we do know that he is going to be taking questions from reporters later on this afternoon. So we should hear from him directly to get his reaction. And
on the question of the two different confidence votes, there's one that's been brought by the Tories, which is a vote of no confidence in him specifically, and one that's been brought by Labour that they want to hold a vote of no confidence in the whole Scottish Government. That would mean he has to resign along with all of his ministers. The first option would mean he had to resign, but the SNP could try to replace him, becoming the third First Minister, of course, since the last election. Would you expect the two results to be identical, or could there be some members of Holyrood who would vote differently according to whether it was a vote of confidence in Humza Yousaf or a vote of confidence in the whole Scottish Government?
Yes, I think that's probably the likely scenario. I would struggle to see, despite the anger in the Scottish Greens, for instance, at the moment, that they would vote to bring down the Scottish Government as a whole. And I think, really, although Labour have said they're tabling that motion and that they relish the prospect of an extraordinary general election for Holyrood in Scotland, I'm not sure any party is really in a position, either in terms of having candidates or having the finances, to have two elections in 1 year, because of course we're expecting a general election as well, James. So I think if Humza Yousaf loses the vote of no confidence in him, I mean, he could try and cling on. It's not a binding vote, but obviously he'd be seriously undermined, and it would look
if he goes, Gina,
to get anything through.
If he goes, who would be in the mix? What sort of hats might we expect? Because Ash Regan can hardly throw her hat back into the ring, can she?
Well, what would happen is you would find all of the opposition parties put forward their leaders to be First Minister. Of course, none of them would have enough votes for that to actually happen. The SNP would have to decide if it would be Shona Robison, who's the Deputy First Minister, or they might look at somebody like Neil Gray, who is the current Health Secretary and is seen very much as a safe pair of hands and is well liked pretty much through the backbenches of the SNP, which is just as important, of course, as through the rest of the Parliament, particularly if you're now working as a minority government and you need to have support from other parties in terms of getting any of your policy agenda through. So they might well decide that they can struggle on with an SNP government, but with a new First Minister in place. And then, of course, they'd have to have an SNP leadership election all over again, because, I mean, first, Hamza Yousaf's position as leader of the SNP would be pretty much untenable if he was no longer the First Minister. So we could expect that later in the year as well. So everything, James, is absolutely up in the air.
Do you think he will be First Minister this time next month?
This time next month?
Yeah.
Oh, well, you never really should place bets on these things. I think it absolutely all lies in the hands of Ash Regan at the moment of what she might want for her support.
Fair enough. No, I respect your diplomacy, your delicacy. I mean, you of course have to go into press conferences regardless of who is in charge next month. But I also note your reticence. Gina Davidson, LBC's political editor in Scotland. Many thanks indeed. 11:41 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we return to, one of those phone-ins that I certainly wouldn't have had the confidence to do 20 years ago. If you're just tuning in now and wondering what the question is, well, the short answer is none of us really know. We're talking about a clip of or a moment on Question Time last night, which I will remind you of shortly, and we are almost saying, how has it come to this?
Chris, I come from a neighbouring country called Congo, if you know geographically that it's located right next door to Rwanda. And right now in Goma there's a genocide going on, and there's such a big conflict going on with people from Rwanda. So had my family members come from Goma on a crossing right now, would they then be sent back to the country that they're supposedly warring, Rwanda? Does that make any sense to you?
No, I think there's an exclusion on people from Rwanda being sent to Rwanda.
They're not from Rwanda, they're from Congo.
They're from Congo.
And
they're
supposedly warring these people from Rwanda. Are they then going to be sent to Rwanda if they came here on a crossing?
From
Congo? Yeah.
Would people be sent from... Well, I mean, Rwanda is a different country of Congo, isn't it? It's a different country.
Yes.
It is.
Yes. Definitely. You're saying if they come from a war zone in Congo, would they then be sent to Rwanda? That's the point he's making.
So there is a clause in the legislation that says if somebody would suffer, I think the phrase is serious and irreversible harm by being sent somewhere, they wouldn't be sent. So there is that safety mechanism built into the legislation.
It is 11:42 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Kevin's in Perth. Kevin, tempting though it may be to wade back into Scottish politics, I'd rather that you focused on Chris Philp. How has it come to this, mate?
So I first time caller, James. I'm a bit nervous here.
It's only me. Welcome.
I know. So here's what I think's happened here. I think the question is why's this guy ended up looking like a bit of an idiot on national TV talking about the government's
for a terrible moment. For a terrible moment, I thought you were going to go a little bit rude but no, that's fine. Carry on.
No, don't worry.
Thank you.
I'll keep it. I'll keep my language down to a minimum if I can. Yes. But I think we need to be honest and admit. I mean, these MPs that are getting dragged out in the media circus, they'll all be briefed on the government's policy. They know what the policy is. And a little bit of me has some sympathy with them because I think this Rwanda policy is so flawed at its very core. As soon as someone asks a question that's just slightly out with that brief, they can't answer it.
Yeah.
They know that the policy is broken. They know that it doesn't work. They know that it's unpopular. And as soon as they get asked a question like that, they look like an idiot.
Do you want to know something funny?
Go on. I could do with a laugh.
I had to build a structure out of spaghetti and marshmallows on Tuesday night. Have you ever done this?
No, I can't say I have. It sounds like a challenge.
The idea is that the winner is the person who builds the structure highest.
Right.
And The people that won built almost like a kind of, it looked like a DNA helix. It was absolutely beautiful. And you use the marshmallows as the... We didn't win. Me and Dan Snow, the historian, were on the same team. And we would have come third if they'd come to measure it when we asked them to. But the whole idea was that it had to be freestanding. But we knew that ours was not going, because we kind of just stuck stuff together and hoped that it would hold, and the marshmallows didn't melt a bit and the spaghetti didn't snap. But for about 12 to 15 seconds, our structure was actually quite high. And then it started slowly listing, and then we tried to... And when the judge came round, it fell over because you weren't allowed to touch it. That's what they've done. They've constructed a policy out of spaghetti and marshmallows, haven't they? And all they need to do is get one plane into the air, which is measuring the structure when the judge is there. And then it doesn't matter if the whole thing falls apart and falls down and lists and collapses and all the marshmallows start subsequently melting. That's what's happening.
Yeah, it's not a real policy.
It's not a real policy.
It's something that they've made up to appease a few voters back in 2022 when something like this... It may have been a little bit more popular then with their voters, I don't know. But what it is today is, as you say, it's so
he can never get into trouble. He can't get into trouble for messing it up and not understanding, because nobody does. It would be like, oh dear, what a mess. Anyway, try that, Kevin. It's fun. I don't know if you've got any kids, but it's a great way of keeping people out of trouble for a while. 11:46 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we've just concluded that the Rwanda policy is, metaphorically speaking, constructed from spaghetti and marshmallows, but not in an effective helix-type way, just in a stick it all together and hope that the plane gets into the air before the whole thing falls apart, as it surely must. It's 10 to 12. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where I'm quite pleased with that. You can always tell, can't you? You can tell when I'm feeling quite pleased with myself because my lips move. But that marshmallow and spaghetti thing, which I did have enormous fun with on Tuesday night, even though we were rubbish, it does fit. The idea that that's what this policy is built of, and people like Chris Philp know it. Listen, of course it's a mess. Of course it is. The other thing I noticed in today's news, Macron's criticised the Rwanda scheme, criticised the UK government. Do you want to know a quite well-established fascist tactic? If a foreign politician criticises the UK government, or if somebody foreign criticises the government or a government policy, the fascistic way to respond to that is to pretend that they are criticising the country. It's quite well-established trope, this. They're not that they are attacking the UK. They are attacking England. The president of France is attacking us. He's not. He's attacking a ridiculous policy, an abandonment essentially of the rule of law, and a desperate attempt to redefine the meaning of actual words. Uses the phrase European values, which is precisely how Winston Churchill would see it if he was still with us today, particularly with reference to one of his most abiding and beautiful legacies, the European Convention on Human Rights. But if you can't, just a quick heads up. The story hasn't received much coverage, but I've spotted it in a couple of papers. The idea that Macron is attacking he's attacking people like Chris Philp because they support policies that they do not understand. And they cannot understand the policy because they are not across even the most basic geography of the relevant region. But the question of how this happened is pertinent. And it speaks to a much deeper malaise. Imran is in Lewisham. Imran, tell me about the deeper malaise.
The deeper malaise? Well, I think I wanted to talk about I was watching Question Time yesterday, and I saw what happened with that Chris Phelps, and Philp. I think it just Philps.
Singular. It's Philp singular. I don't know why I'm getting pedantic about that, but I don't want him getting off the hook because people are getting his name wrong. It's Philp. Chris Philp. Carry on.
Philp. And I think it was just, this policy has just like a sniff of like kind of racism to it.
Go on.
And I think the whole Question Time, it was in Edmonton, they were talking about deprivation and, how things were looking. And I think this guy, who seemed quite educated, was trying to be really polite and do a really, reasonable question. And this guy just seemed to just brush over things. It seems very like Boris Johnson light. He's just like, I don't know if he came in that election and, just seemed very like that and just making these gaffes. I think the combination of that and this policy just being completely ridiculous, I think just made it so funny.
It really was. It was. Well, you say funny, and I did laugh at first, but it's not really funny at all. This man has risen to a senior position in the UK government, in His Majesty's government. I only say that because it makes it sound more impressive from the fact that
he's a businessman.
Well, that's not an obstacle to being a decent politician. Look at Donald Trump.
True.
That was a joke. I guess what I'm trying to pin down is how I'm trying to think of another line of work where you could mess up so completely and know that you'd be absolutely fine in the morning. You can't, can you?
I think this is why your first caller said, Conservatives can't get in. We must vote differently. I think they need to regroup. They need to be humiliated and regroup. This policy is so bad. It was made by Boris Johnson. It was made by Priti Patel. And, when they were choosing which country they wanted to do this, they had a range of countries they could have chosen.
I don't know that they did, actually. I don't know that they did. I don't know that there would be many other countries prepared to sign up for it. If there was a safe country that was prepared to sign up for it, I think they'd have bitten their arm off, wouldn't they?
So they couldn't have sent them to the Falklands, or?
Oh, I see what you mean. Well, I mean that's British territory, that's British soil, so that wouldn't really solve the problem at all. And I think you might be making the mistake of not making the distinction between processing and destination. You could process people offshore, but then they would still have the right to settle in the United Kingdom when their application had been proven to be sound. This is very different. This you never come back. Despite Ian Duncan-Smith actually appeared on LBC and argued that if your application is successful, you come and live in the UK. Not understanding the most basic tenets of this legislation doesn't seem to be any obstacle whatsoever to supporting it publicly as a member of the Conservative Party. Thank you, Imran. Jim's in Glasgow. Jim, what would you like to say?
Morning, James.
Hello, Jim.
Just before I make my point, I'm 3/4 of the way through your new latest book. My God, what a read that is!
Oh, that's very kind. I was worried then. I thought you were about to ask for a refund.
Oh, what they should do is put it in every school in the country and maybe put a couple of 100 copies into the House of Commons.
I'd be all for that, actually. I'd even go without my royalty in order to get it in front of the children and indeed the politicians of the country. Paperback out this week for anybody who hasn't read it yet. How They Broke Britain. Thank you, Jim. On with the call.
Right. The reason that we all know that these people are just the figurehead for each department. Dominic, Chris Philps was found out to be what he was last night, and he's just an ignorant person.
Yes.
Now, it's all your civil servants do all the work, but the problem now is when Boris get rid of what I would call the decent MPs like Dominic Grieve, Anna Soubry, even Kenneth Clark, this is what we've got left. And I'll just give you 4 names of why we're in the mess we're in the now.
Go on.
Jonathan Gullis, 30p Lee, Suella Braverman, Priti Patel. I'll give you another one. Liz Truss.
Yeah. If Liz Truss can become Prime Minister, then we can't really sit here wringing our hands about the fact that Chris Philp can become a minister, can we? Really?
Exactly. Now, there's standards. There's supposed to be standards kept in their job. It's a very low bar. They couldn't even put that into the Olympics now. It'd be that low.
It's a talent thimble. A talent thimble. We start off with a talent pool. We move on to a talent puddle. We're left possibly contemplating a talent thimble. Thank you, Jim, and thank you for the kind words about the book as well, which I make no apology for promoting this week. It's the week that the paperback comes out. There's some mad promotional activity next week, which I'll tell you a little bit more about at the time. But it's not like my other books. This is a history book. This actually explains how people like Chris Philp can end up on Question Time advertising his complete ignorance of a policy that he is there to support. Rashid is in Caterham. Rashid, what's happened?
Hi, James. Good morning. Yeah, I think there's many angles to this incompetence and what have you. But I think one of the angles, and I think somebody kind of alluded to it, is that there's a bit of racism here. It's kind of benign racism, you like. And I think the reason why he can't differentiate between Congo, I think it's DRC, and and Rwanda is because he doesn't care to. As far as he's concerned, it's the African people. They're all the same, just one big continent, in fact, if anything, one big country, and that's it. So there's no desire to find out what these people or who these people are, what they are.
So I can see why you say racism, because he is deploying standards of curiosity and inquiry that he would not deploy if he was discussing European countries.
Absolutely, or even even an American country, dare I say, but because it's Africa. And
is that different? Is that different? That country goes, oh, flipping heck. It's only like that kind of attitude.
Yeah, absolutely. Don't care. Don't really know what. So it's African, isn't it? Yeah. Congo, Rwanda, whatever you call it. Same thing, same place, same people, whatever.
The West and the rest, I think, is a phrase that I've heard before, and so displaying, and he's far from alone in doing that. And you could argue that it's hard to resist it if you've been educated in a certain way in a certain system, but. But there it is, The West and the rest could be a part of the explanation. Thank you, Rashid. Quite a lot of people speaking up about another guest on the programme, Victor Adibawale, who heads up a health organisation. He was brilliant. I don't stay up late enough to watch Question Time. I only watch the bits the next day that have set social media on fire. But he played an absolute blinder. I may share some of his contributions with you shortly, and I may also take on board the clamour of people calling for me to get him on Full Disclosure. There's no curse yet on Full Disclosure. Hamza Yusuf was on it quite recently, as a few of you have pointed out, but his current travails cannot in any way be tracked back to that appearance. Up next, is losing a pet really like losing a child? It's 3 minutes after 12. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where the conversation takes an unexpected turn now, not down the avenue I just mentioned. Do you know, as those words came out of my mouth, there's a story in the newspaper today about how having a pet stolen is like losing a child. But as I said those words, and I like to do something on Fridays at 12 o'clock that is a little bit further away from the more obvious news agenda. But even as I said those words out loud, I thought that's gone far too Alan Partridge. I can't do that on the radio. I mean, for a whole... And it's absolutely awful to have a pet stolen. I can't begin to think... When we thought we'd lost our cat, we thought our cat had disappeared. It was a family trauma. But I don't know that the parallel that's been published in the journal Human Animal Interactions is... I don't think it's very helpful or necessarily appropriate. And there's another animal-based story that I wanted to talk about. And I didn't have the... Guts isn't quite the right word. There's one story I haven't got the guts to do. All right? And it's in the news at the moment. And the angle I would like to take on it, I don't know that... We've come close. We have flirted with this topic. I did this on the show yesterday. I took a call during Mystery Hour from somebody... And the location coupled with the question he was answering nearly made me say something that I think would have been quite inappropriate. And I asked you if you'd noticed. And one person had. And Keith had as well, actually. Keith had spotted it. But he listens to the programme a little bit more closely than... Well, he's supposed to listen to the programme a little bit more closely than most people do. I wonder if you know what the story is that you've heard mention of. I mentioned it very, very briefly at the top of the show today. Just in the talk-up that I do while Nick's still in the studio. That I can't really ever, I don't think, approach from the angle that I would like to. And this is an entirely self-indulgent project, by the way. I just want to know. I just want to see whether anyone will now WhatsApp me and say, I know what the story is that you want to talk about in a way that you don't feel you'd get away with in the current climate. And I'll just see whether or not you do know or you have clocked what that story might be. I'll tell you what I might do. I might allude to the story in the course of the next hour, but without in any way making it clear that that's the story that I'm talking about. Yeah? And then see whether or not you go, oh, I bet that's it. And he wants to actually ask that question, but he knows he can't ask that question because the world is not now ready and possibly never will be. 6 minutes after 12 is the time. Imagine if you just tuned in now. You have absolutely no idea what's going on. Absolutely no clue. So what has he done? He's asking people to he said something but didn't say it, and he's asking them if they know what it was that he said. I'll give you a little clue. £2.25 million. All right? It's 6 minutes after 12. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where I am turning my attention next to a story that I really, really, really want to handle sensitively. It's prompted by certainly the picture of the week, if not the story of the week. And it involves the 5 horses that went on the run earlier this week. They've of course all been recovered. 3 of them are fine. 2 of them are in a relatively serious condition. Henry Riley this morning on LBC had a very strong exclusive about claims from a whistleblower that the horses are indeed kept in a barracks. Horses at the Household Cavalry are kept in a barracks that are inappropriate for their needs. That's according to a whistleblower whose credentials Henry Riley has established beyond doubt. Some people may, of course, dispute that analysis, but the credentials of the whistleblower are indisputable. But I have recently started seeing these horses a lot more often than ever before. I've lived in London for a long time, for 30-odd years. But I've never really been making my way through Hyde Park by bicycle every morning until the last month. And it's a bit of a coincidence, really, that the horses themselves should become so newsworthy in precisely the month in which I've been encountering them every single day. I saw a lovely moment the other day when a fella must have come out of the barracks. I think his job is to walk the regimental mascot in the morning, because he was in full uniform and he was taking a dog for a walk. And I presume you can't take your own dogs in, can you? If you're in the army, you can't just sort of have a pet. So I presume it was some sort of regimental mascot, or possibly the commanding officer is allowed to have a dog. And it was this fella's job to take so he's in full uniform, walking a dog over and I'd stopped on my line bike because the light was red. And he's walking over the pedestrian crossing, and he does a full salute at the horses that are coming up the path behind me. And it's sort of a sideways salute because he's walking the dog. So he's got the dog in one hand, he's got the lead in one hand, and he's saluting with the other hand, and he's turning to the right, which is where the horses were. And because I was on my line bike and I didn't want to wobble or fall off, I didn't look round to see whether all of the soldiers... I did cross my mind for a moment he was saluting me, but I realised in the nick of time that he wasn't, so I didn't salute back. What I don't know is whether or not all of the horse riders behind me would then have saluted him back, or whether it would just be the officer at the front. I don't know. Don't at me on this. Well, you can at me, but don't ring me, all right? And earlier this week, I told you I saw some what I presume are Shire horses, the ones with all the the really big horses, big old horses, with all the hair around their hooves. Beautiful animals, but really big. And it did cross my mind at that point that there was a bit of an anachronism in front of me. I can't imagine there is any military need, I thought, and said to you, I think, yesterday, I can't imagine there is any military need for Shire horses anymore. You think, as I do, of Michael Morpurgo's War Horse, so beautifully realised on the stage by the National Theatre, and the role that horses played in the First World War was obviously crucial and enormous. But I can't imagine there's any need for those sort of horses. And then, actually, after the show yesterday, when I was making my way back home, I sort of realised that there's probably not much need for any horses in the military anymore. And then Henry, and I didn't know Henry was doing this, then Henry pops up, as he is wont to do. Henry pops up with this exclusive, suggesting that the horses are not kept in optimal conditions. The whistleblower who spoke to Henry, saying that she had worked with those same horses at that barracks for 2 years, but left a few months ago, in part because her concerns about the welfare of the animals had and the conditions they are kept in had been ignored. I will play you some of that interview, although it's voiced by somebody else. And that really crystallised my thoughts this morning. I found myself thinking that because it's under our noses, and because it happens all the time, and because we never really question it, we may have missed something that we should have noticed, which is, should we still have horses in the military? I think the case for the police having horses is stronger because they are needed operationally. I don't know what would replace a horse policing all the gammon that were in London earlier this week, sort of spilling Stella Artois all over monuments and hitting police horses with umbrellas. I've been in circumstances, usually at football games at Wembley, where the horses are used as almost as barriers, organic living barriers. So there is, but I don't think there's any military engagement, is there, for horses? So I don't want to, there's two things I don't want to happen. I don't want this to go all vegan, all right? And I don't mean that offensively, but I don't want to have a conversation about why no human should ever employ any animal. Well, actually, maybe that's not fair. Maybe that is a powerful argument against using horses in the military. But neither do I want to poo-poo the importance of ceremony. I like ceremony. I know that it has overtones and indeed undertones, but there's not a lot else left, is there, that we can truly claim to be the best in the world at. And we've got a pretty big claim to being the best in the world at pageantry. And whether you like it or not, that's world stage territory. That's, we have a coronation, or God forbid, the funeral of a monarch, and there is nowhere in the world that does that quite like we do. Now, you don't have to be proud of that or even impressed by it, but you can't really argue with the contention. And horses are quite a big part of that. But is it actually inhumane now to keep these horses solely for what? Who's going to be qualified to answer these questions? People who've worked in the military. Let's start with the facts. Is there any military application for a horse in 2024? 0345 6060 973. Are there any circumstances in which soldiers would use horses to do their job rather than to simply pomp and ceremony? And if there isn't, is that really a big enough reason to keep them in circumstances that appear, certainly according to this whistleblower that's spoken to Henry, that appear to be unkind? Hit the numbers now, you will get through. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. One whistleblower does not a scandal make. Of course, well, that's not true, actually. Just look at the post office. But have a listen to what this whistleblower has to say about the animals from the Household Cavalry. Because my question goes a little further than this. Even if they were being kept in the kind of circumstances that MPs enjoy, if they were being kept in the lap of luxury at public expense, then I still don't know that there would be a case. Do we if they don't do anything military, why do we have them? But anyway, here's the whistleblower whose voice has been changed to protect her anonymity.
It happens very often, and those horses are so nervous, so ready to explode that, yeah, it happens way more often than in other places. I don't think it's a healthy environment, because it doesn't provide what a horse needs, a bit of space. It's difficult work for them, because when they're on parades, I understand the equipment weighs about 20 kilos. So, they need a really strong back, they need some relaxation after.
12:15 is the time. Just focusing on this week's events and the bigger picture and the whistleblower that Henry Riley has contacted. Here's the question. You can answer it however you want. Why does the army need horses? So there's two questions. Why does the army have horses? 0345 6060 973. And why does the army need horses? 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. 18 minutes after 12 is the time. So why does the army have horses? And should the army have horses? I'm asking the question. I'm not comfortable with the question because at the beginning of the rides through Hyde Park in the morning, I was transported by the sight of these horses. I thought it was powerful and beautiful. I love horses. But scenes earlier this week when the five went on the rampage and subsequent reports, not least Henry Riley's exclusive this morning, suggest that maybe maybe we're doing the horses a disservice. So does the army need horses? And if not, why does it still have them? Should it still have them? You can come at this from whatever angle you want. I've got some amazing texts already, which I'll get to, but let's take a call first. Ryan is in Liverpool. Ryan, what would you like to say?
Hi there. I'm previous 10 years Army in the ceremonial regiment in London.
Okay.
It wasn't the Household Cavalry itself, it was the King's Troop, which is arguably like the same stuff. We do the same duties.
Yeah.
And I've only just heard this whistleblower thing this morning, and I feel like she's done a bit of a disservice to the regiment.
Okay.
Like throughout the year, the cavalry or the army itself sends horses out to grass for like 5-6 months at a time, and they literally just live in a field wild. They've got hundreds of acres to run about in and stuff like that. So to say that like they need space and they don't get the time off and stuff like that, they need.
Well, she didn't. You can both be right. For the other for the other 5 or 6 months of the year, they don't get the space and the things that they need. So I don't know that you're necessarily undermining her testimony.
No, what she said isn't wrong, but I just feel like she's doing a bit of a disservice.
She's missed a bit out. She's missed. So for half of the year, they don't get enough sunlight. They're often stuck inside, and they might only exercise for an hour a day. But for the rest of the year, they're in like Flynn. They're living the dream.
Yeah, they're completely wild, pretty much.
Okay. What? Can I ask you a silly question? You promise not to get cross with me.
I'll try.
No, that's not good enough. You have to promise. You're a former soldier. I'm not risking that. So you say you're a ceremonial regiment.
Yes.
So what happens when but you're not exclusively ceremonial. If there's a war, you'll be in the thick of it.
Yeah, so there's 2 ceremonial regiments in the army. One is the King's Troop Royal Horse Artillery.
Yes.
And one is the Household Cavalry Mounted Regiment.
Right.
So the Household Cavalry has 2 parts to it. So they have a tanks side and they have like a ceremonial side. But the King's Troop Royal Horse Artillery is purely ceremonial.
Okay.
But soldiers still go on tour and still do like operational duties. It's just primarily the focus of that regiment that does ceremonial duties.
Okay, and well, that's perfectly normal. But there's no military application for a horse in the 21st century.
No, the only thing basically it's just pageantry now.
Well, there's the question. I mean, is that a big enough reason for the privations that the horses endure? Admittedly, not for the entire year, but for several months a year. You presumably think that it is.
Well, I'm of both opinions. Like, there's no right or wrong opinion here. There's arguments to and for. Obviously, the pageantry, and as you say, like, at what point, if we say, okay, we no longer do the horses, and then when do we stop? Do we start getting rid of the guards regiments and stuff like that? Also, however, like these, as bad as it sounds, like imagine these horses are only bred for military application.
Yeah.
So the argument is like the horses wouldn't exist if they didn't have this military application for them, generally, because the majority of the horses are bred like the certain type of like heavy hunter or like the breed of the horse won't be applicable for many other things.
Yeah, you're far too. I mean, you're too diplomatic to be a radio phone-in host. You're essentially saying it's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. But
yeah, well, there is argument for both. I obviously
you're right. The question is, you do, and I really respect you for working so hard to see the other side as well. It just comes down to a question of how important pageant. Okay, here's a question for you, Ryan. How rubbish would pageantry be if we didn't have the horses?
It'd be diminished quite greatly.
Did you just do an impression of your favourite horse, then?
That was a Freudian slip there.
Yeah, but I'm just thinking about the really big state events. You'd need them to pull the carriages, I suppose, but you wouldn't have the troops on them.
The carriages, they pull the guns, they fire gun salutes, and then you have the Household Cavalry, which are the lifeguards every day. You see at Whitehall, they do state opening of Parliament, all that kind of stuff. It's not a kind of just big occasion things. There's little things constantly going on that might not make like mainstream media stuff. But like the incident in London the other day, like these horses have been exercised through London every single day apart from Sunday.
Yes.
For over 100 years now, and this is like one of the handful of times in that amount of time it's happened where something's gone wrong. Yes, when it goes wrong, it's been a massive spectacle, and obviously the welfare of the horses and the jockeys are paramount.
Is it a good use, asks John Hutchinson, is it a good use of increasingly scarce MOD funding?
Well, the problem you've got is it's balancing the books, because a lot of the pageantry and a lot of the ceremonial stuff that happens in London, people come for the military aspect of it. So
they do. I know they do. Yeah, I think you're right. I think this may even be too nuanced, because you can't. What would the pageantry be like without the horses? But is that a big enough reason? If the horses are suffering or not living their best lives, is that a big enough reason for them? One thing I would pick Ryan up on, because you've just reminded me in a WhatsApp message, is that the argument about them being bred for the purpose is the same argument that's used to defend bullfighting, and various other blood sports, I suppose you'd have to describe them as. No one's suggesting that this is a blood sport, but saying that, well, if we didn't... I mean, you get it for vegetarianism as well, don't you? Well, these species wouldn't exist if we didn't eat them. I always find that a sort of morally quite circular argument. 25 minutes after 12 is the time. So why... I guess it's quite a hard question to... No one wants to actually say, no, we should get rid of the horses. You wouldn't be getting rid of the horses. They can go and retire somewhere nice in a field. But you would not have horses in the pageantry, and then the pageantry would be a little bit rubbish. But that's what pageantry is, isn't it? It's a nostalgic. It's harking back, and therefore it isn't rational. And yet most of us quite like it. Matthew's in Launceston. Matthew, what made you pick up the phone?
Oh, hi there.
Hello.
Yeah, nice to speak to you.
We'll see.
Yeah, well, I'm a gardener. I live in Cornwall, and quite a large property that I worked at.
Oh, yeah.
They went down and bought a horse from the lifeguards, I believe it was.
Really?
From London. Yeah, and brought it home to their fields. I've never seen anything like it. It saw a field for the very first time. The face was just extraordinary, and it bolts into the field. Never seen anything like it.
Are you sure? Because the last fella told us that they spent half a year in a field.
Well, this one never did. I know that because they picked it up. I think it reached the end of its days working. But, trying to prevent it getting into the field that I was told to do, it jumped the barrier and it went straight past me, probably 2 foot away. Big animals.
They are.
Very dangerous, but not acclimatised and very difficult to control.
So
I don't know. Sorry.
Well, no, I'm sorry. I'm interrupting everyone today, even more than usual. Must be something in my tea. The question is becoming really whether or not this is unfair on horses. Having horses in the military is unfair on horses.
Well, it seems so conditioned by its life that it had a real problem when it actually hit the rural environment. I'm around animals all the time, so but this is.
I can hear them in the background.
Yeah, probably can.
So that's what do you think then? Just using this as one example, but broadening it out, is keeping horses in the army for ceremonial purposes, is it unfair? Is it inhumane? Is it unfair on the horses?
Well, it all depends where they end up, I suppose, doesn't it?
I don't think it does. I don't think it does. If the circumstances, I mean, it's not a natural life for a horse to be living in a stable in the middle of Knightsbridge, is it?
No, it isn't, and it's very obvious that it's not. But then, like you say, it's what they do. It's got to have a place, all these animals, don't they?
Yes and no. I mean, this is why the conversation is, you can tell it makes me a tiny bit uncomfortable, because I like it on one level, and I don't want to be one of those kind of moaning minis complaining about the traditions, but if it's not nice for the horses, it's odd that it hasn't come in for more criticism before. Andrew is just up the road from you, Matthew. He's in Penzance. You're in Launceston. My wife, writes Andrew, is a world authority on horses and was a world-ranked dressage rider. She and I both agree that the default should be that horses are not used unnecessarily for work and certainly not for entertainment. We keep using the words pageantry and ceremony when what we really mean is entertainment, isn't it? They're just there for entertainment. One day we will look back with shame on how we treat horses. Christina says the horses I saw were never nervous, and they are not there all year round, but are often taken out to pasture during the year. She used to live in Knightsbridge, next to the barracks that are under discussion. And Tom goes there. He says it's all very well to say we're the best at pageantry, but one, who cares? It doesn't butter any parsnips. And two, are you sure we're the best at pageantry? I'm sure that the French flag wavers love a well-dressed horse just as much as the UK flag wavers do. Well, I don't yet. All right, I take your point. I've just got a feeling that because we've got a royal family and the regiments that we're talking about have very deep royal connections, the King's Troop, the Royal Household Cavalry, that there is an extra dimension of pageantry that occurs when horses and royals meet. It's coming up to 12:30. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. We return to matters Middle Eastern after the headlines because, well, there's quite a lot going on, not least a slight clarification of one of the most notable moments in the conversation outside the battle, if you like, outside the conflict, the conversation about the possible genocide that is underway in Gaza, in some people's opinion, and the role that the court in The Hague has played in the definition of those words and in the plausibility, that's a crucial word, of what's gone on. A helpful clarification that I will share with you shortly. And we'll also catch up on that story of the mass graves being discovered in the vicinity of 2 hospitals in Gaza after Israeli troops withdrew. But before that, Tim Humphrey is here with your headlines. 33 minutes after 12 is the time. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we turn our attention next to the incredibly and eternally tricky territory of the Middle East, notably the continuing conflict in Gaza, where attacks on Rafah appear to have gathered pace overnight. But before we do that, I want to return you to that finding at the International Court of Justice and the widespread reporting that it had found the allegations of genocide brought by South Africa to be plausible. A woman called Joan Donoghue, who's a former president of the International Court of Justice, has given an interview to the Hard Talk programme on the BBC in which she clarifies that point. I say clarifies. She may have caused a little bit more confusion than previously existed. But it is clear that the description of the court case, or the court having found the allegation of genocide to be plausible, isn't quite what happened. Listen carefully to this.
Would it be fair to say, and I'm no lawyer, and many people watching and listening will not be lawyers, but would it be fair to say that the key point that you made your initial order and ruling upon was whether or not there was a plausible case that should be taken on by the court of genocide in the case of Israel's actions in Gaza after October 7, and you quite clearly decided that there was a plausible case? Is it right to say that's at the heart of what you decided?
You know, I'm glad I have a chance to address that, because the court's test for deciding whether to impose measures uses the idea of plausibility, but the test is the plausibility of the rights that are asserted by the applicant, in this case, South Africa. So the court decided that the Palestinians had a plausible right to be protected from genocide, and that South Africa had the right to present that claim in the court. It then looked at the facts as well, but it did not decide, and this is something where I'm correcting what's often said in the media, it didn't decide that the claim of genocide was plausible. It did emphasize in the order that there was a risk of irreparable harm to the Palestinian right to be protected from genocide. But the shorthand that often appears, which is that there's a plausible case of genocide, isn't what the court decided.
12:36 is the time. It's worth listening to a second bit of this interview as well. Some questions about whether or not Joan Donoghue should have given this interview in the first place. She is no longer a judge. She's stepped down as president of the International Court of Justice in The Hague. But the question of what that original finding and reports of it were, what was designed to achieve, is another area in which this is a particularly interesting intervention, I think.
What you did say in your ruling is this: in relation to Palestinians in Gaza, Israel must take all measures within its power to prevent the commission of acts within the scope of the Genocide Convention. It's now weeks and months since you issued that order. Do you think Israel is complying with it?
So I won't answer the question directly because it's actually a question that will be before the court, but I will say personally, it's disappointing what has happened since then. I mean, we hoped at the time that our closely watched order would be more of a contributor to a solution. And you'll recall that at that time, there was a lot going on in terms of negotiations, etc. And while I assumed I would never know how our order might play into those negotiations, I hoped that it could be a factor that would help push things towards an outcome in which hostages were released and the tragedy would end in Gaza.
So I guess if you were to break it down, there is a distinction to be drawn between the conclusion that the allegation of genocide being brought against Israel is plausible and the finding that the Palestinian people's right to be protected from genocide is plausible. So I think perhaps predictably there's an awful lot of excitement in some corners of social media about this interview, and it's entirely up to you what you how important you think that distinction is. So is the allegation of genocide plausible? That's not what the court found. Is the finding that the Palestinian people's right to be protected from genocide plausible, and will the case therefore progress? Yes, that is indeed plausible. So I mean, I'm tempted to lean into what a lecturer in international relations and war studies at King's College London, Alonso Mendy, has said in This Morning, calling questions on whether or not she should have got involved in this because it's likely to influence proceedings in court. But I mean, she's the judge; she'd know about that. But this line here, I'd read you before we move on. The plausibility refers to the rights asserted, and so the International Court of Justice decided that Palestinians had a plausible right to be protected from genocide, but it did not decide that the claim of genocide was plausible. And as I say, that reading into that, the significance of that distinction will be very much in the eye of the beholder. But I think it's important, if there is confusion out there, it's those of us who are dedicated, sometimes in the face of extraordinary criticism from everybody else, those of us who are dedicated to the facts, if there are opportunities for clarification or changes, if you like, in the perceived narrative, it's incredibly important to provide them. Otherwise, you run the risk of becoming like that spokesman who got fired for so passionately pursuing the position that turned out later not to be true. 12:39 is the time. Noga Tarnopolsky is a freelance journalist in Jerusalem who has helped us out on many occasions over the last 6 months with perspectives that may perhaps be missing from some corners of the UK media. I want to go straight into the reports of the mass graves this week being found in the Gaza Strip at two different burial sites outside two different hospitals, the Nasser and the Al-Shifa Hospital. What's your understanding, Noga, of the latest situation?
Well, to the best of my ability to understand, and I'm speaking to you from Jerusalem, not from Gaza.
Of course.
I believe that these are most likely the same mass graves which caused a previous scandal sometime, if I'm not mistaken, in November or possibly December. I don't know if you remember, there were very shocking pictures of Palestinians burying their deads in these kind of blue plastic body bags, just piles and piles of bodies. To the best of my ability to understand, these are exactly the same graves which we have seen and what the Israeli military, which is being very opaque now, has previously explained, is that they opened up these graves to look for bodies of Israeli hostages who may have been killed since, to see if those bodies had been hidden among them, and then returned the bodies, having not found those bodies they were looking for. That's my best guess, but it's important, it really, almost in the context of this other subject that you were just discussing, similarly, it's important to lay out the facts as we know them, and it's also important in this case to say that the reason even the United States, Israel's top ally, has asked Israel to be careful and to be transparent is because Israel is not permitting any independent journalists or independent observers in. And, when the UN says records, in other words, have to be preserved of these mass graves, it's almost self-evident. One would hope that bodies and records of death will be preserved anywhere, including here. And so the UN isn't saying much. It's almost a banality. To hear the United States say that they want transparency from Israel, I take more seriously. Nonetheless, the main issue here is that Israel, the spokesperson for the Israeli army appears to be overwhelmed and does not have the ability to respond to all what I consider legitimate questions. And so a matter like this, involving people who are already dead, falls by the wayside in a week in which other news, for example, a video of a hostage who's still alive, takes precedence.
The 283 bodies exhumed at Nasser, as you remind us, some with their hands tied. If I've understood you correctly, Noga, we're talking about the first opportunities that Palestinian officials have had to exhume these bodies since the withdrawal of the IDF.
Yes, although I think we're talking about Hamas officials, and I'd like to underscore that, because Hamas has very, very clear political interests and powerful interests here. The Palestinian Authority, which is the internationally recognized authority and which ruled Gaza before Hamas, took over in a coup d'etat, they don't have access, like no one else is having access. The only other group that could have access is Israel, and they're not speaking. So what we're hearing is the Hamas narrative, and they are being quite successful without ever explicitly saying Israel murdered these people. They're leaving that impression in the air. And Israel is allowing, for its own reasons, allowing that impression to go forth without clearly responding.
So once again, we have to register the suboptimal status of not having either independent organisations or journalists on the ground. Let's go back then to the other story that you mentioned, because you're right, it does deserve more attention, and you're referring, I think, to the footage of Hersh Goldberg Polin being released earlier this week. It's known somewhat.
The footage was released. He has not been released.
No, exactly. It's described somewhat. I don't know. It's a grim phrase, isn't it? A proof of life video. What's Hamas's reasoning, do you think, behind releasing that this week?
Well, I would call it a hostage video in a literal sense. It was released. It's interesting because the White House saw it on Monday night, which is 2 days before it was released on Hamas social media channels. And Monday night was the night that most Jews were sitting down to celebrate the Passover holiday, which is a holiday of freedom. So I think there was a lot of symbolic muscle put into this video. Obviously, he was speaking under coercion. He, and the film was highly edited. I don't know if everyone who's hearing us has seen it. I know that there has been deep fear. His family lives not far from me, so I know from very close friends that while the video did show proof of life, that he was alive Sunday or Monday, because he referred to being alive after almost 200 days of captivity, and he made another few references. On the other hand, while everyone was happy to see him alive, those close to his parents also are terrified, because there have previously been reported cases of some of the hostages used in hostage videos, men who were subsequently executed by their captors. So there's been deep, deep, deep fear accompanying this kind of relief of seeing him alive. And I think you could hear that in the video released by his parents immediately afterwards.
And talk me through briefly, if you would, the protests in Hersh Goldberg Polin's hometown, where police used, I only came across this phrase on your Twitter feed for the first time, the police used something called skunk water. What happened there?
Well, let me first say the protests are ongoing even now. The protests have not stopped. He's a Jerusalem kid, and Wednesday night, when that video became public, everyone from close friends of his to other residents of town really had an eruption of anger, but it was non-violent. The protest, a completely non-violent but angry protest outside the Prime Minister's house, to which the police responded with really repressive measures that I think are fair to say were excessive. And they included this disgusting substance. It feels as if you're being sprayed with sewer water.
Right.
It's not actually that, but that's the feeling.
And I also from your Twitter feed, Noga, which I'd urge everybody interested in these events to follow, is you have some footage of Shuval Ben-Gvir, the son of the man you describe as a convicted terrorist and Israeli Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, saying Israel police should have come with batons and broken the heads of those who protested his father yesterday in Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. So the protest is a Ben-Gvir's failure to secure the release of the hostages, is it?
The protest is against the Netanyahu government's failure to release the hostages and an growing and terrible feeling among Israelis that the government has basically sacrificed these hostages on the altar of this government remaining in power. Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is the national security minister for Netanyahu and is a 13-time convicted hate crime and terror, ex-con. Yeah. Everything I said is accurate.
So I know that. I just don't know that all of my listeners will.
Right. So the minister in charge of the police in Israel and who is having a very detrimental effect on the level of policing and the professionality is an ex-con himself and a ultra... a former prime minister here, Ehud Barak, refers to him and some of the other ministers of his ilk as Israel's Proud Boys. Mm. And I think that might be a useful shorthand to describe who they are.
Noga Tarnopolsky, thank you. It is very, very difficult to get a clear bead on this for some of the reasons that you've just touched, but I always feel better informed, if not uplifted, after listening to your analyses of these unfolding situations. We shall talk again soon. Take care. It is 12:49. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. 12:52 is the time. Breaking news. We're going to give the Daily Telegraph a day off today.
Unhinged headline.
We turn our attention instead to the Daily Mail and indeed a Daily Mail columnist. Now, the job of a Daily Mail columnist is to be perpetually offended about everything. But what do you do when everything you've wanted has happened for the last 14 years? You've had 5 prime ministers that you wanted, albeit that you reserve the right to be critical of them. You would have chosen David Cameron over Gordon Brown. You would have chosen David Cameron over Jeremy Corbyn. You would have chosen Theresa May over Jeremy Corbyn. You would have chosen Theresa May or David Cameron over Ed Miliband. Yeah, so you got all of the politicians, you got all of the prime ministers that you wanted. You got the Brexit that you wanted. You got the austerity that you wanted. You got everything that you wanted, but your job is to be perpetually offended about everything. Richard Littlejohn today takes the art of being offended about everything while pretending that that's not your job to be offended about everything to dizzying heights with the following headline. What really offends me these days is everyone taking offence. I quite like that. I mean, it's almost, how dare all these other people be taking offence at things when my job is literally to take offence at things at least twice a week in a newspaper. Quite often, I don't know what his living arrangements are now, but I suspect they might be more interesting than Angela Rayner's, but quite often from the other side of the Atlantic Ocean would he comment upon the state of British politics or the state of this nation. But now he's run out of things to be offended by, so he's offended by people being offended. And that is, with apologies to the Daily Telegraph for robbing them of their traditional position at the very forefront of this feature, that is today's
Unhinged headline.
We should probably have been paying a little bit more attention and had one that was, we should have the most unhinged headline of the week on Fridays. Do you think that might work? We should actually have then you could get behind them, you could have your favourite. People could agitate for their favourite. We could have little flags waving. I want it to be this one. I want it to be that one. But we didn't. Quick call on horses, maybe 2, and then a quick heads up on this week's full disclosure. Tony is in Leamington Spa. Tony, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello, Tony.
It's a quick one. My dad was in the military in a tank regiment. So obviously any tank regiment would have been a cavalry regiment. So They always then had horses for the parades. Things like that. And I remember where they were kept the stables. They were like right in the middle of where all the work on the tanks was being done. So it was, it wasn't really a really quiet place for them to be living. Do you know what I mean?
Yes. But if they said we're no longer going to have horses in the army, what would your gut reaction be, particularly with your dad's service?
I think it's outdated, isn't it?
Yeah, I do too, but I'm a bit frightened of saying so. I don't want to get attacked by the anti-woke mob.
We've got more horses than tanks.
How do you know?
Look it up. That is a fact. We've got more horses, ceremonial horses, in the British Army than we have tanks.
That's not very good.
It's not good,
just
is it?
in purely military terms, that cannot be a good thing.
No. Honestly, and when you think about the horses that are stood outside, the buildings in London, they're there, just stood still all day.
Yeah, no. Do you know what? It's a bit like one of the. Once you start thinking about it, your brain runs away with you, doesn't it? There's so many examples of this all being a bit bonkers.
Good, is it? It's not good at all. And I think what happened the other day might just draw light to.
It might do. Well, I don't know if it will, because tell you what, if I am the king of woke, Tony, as you may know. Even I'm frightened of going in on this one for fear of what the pushback might feel like. You'll be accused of a lack of patriotism. You'll be accused of all sorts of things. You'll probably be accused of hating the royal family. But it is. won't somebody think of the horses? Thank you, Tony. Speaking of patriotism, Caroline Lucas, the Green Party MP, soon to be ex-MP, has written an extraordinary book about a variety of things. But I want you to listen to this clip because it crystallises notions of Englishness that perhaps get squeezed out of the conversation by our revulsion at the kind of people that were attacking police horses in London earlier this week on St. George's Day. And that we talked about how the flag has been co-opted and hijacked, but she's put forward an incredible thesis in her new book about things being rather more serious and even more subtle than that.
I was really struck in the aftermath of that Brexit vote by the number of people on the Remain side, which was the side that I'd campaigned on, who were saying, I don't recognise my country anymore. And my response to that was, hang on a minute. If we don't, then we should. That's on us. What have we not been listening to? And also, when people said, I don't recognise my country anymore, by and large, they meant England. They didn't mean the UK as a whole. And so as a result of that, I embarked on a project which we called Dear Leavers, which was going out to lots of the Leave voting areas and genuinely listening to what are people's concerns. And two things came out of that, really. One was the real pride people have in the places that they're from. We spent quite a bit of time in Dudley, which is dear to my heart because my mum's from there. And there's a real, legitimate, understandable pride in its industrial heritage, but at the same time, an overwhelming sense of powerlessness because London feels like it's on another planet. People don't feel listened to. They don't feel they have agency. And so this got me thinking about the political structures that we have in the country, but also specifically about how in England, we don't have those political institutions to give a voice to people in England. And it felt like, ironically, when you consider that the Brexit results in England, every region except London did vote to leave. So what was it about that? Why was England voting to leave? And ironically, I think in a way, it was sending a message to an establishment that they understandably felt was out of touch. But the way to do it, in a sense, the question they'd been asked by the establishment wasn't about England or not England. It was about Europe. And so given the opportunity to give the establishment a kicking, then why wouldn't they take it?
And these are impulses and convictions that are much more nuanced and much more sympathetic than simply there are too many foreigners here. And that was one of the distracting, because that's a very real constituency of people and a frequently heard complaint. But you're looking far beyond that.
I am looking far beyond that because I think that is a misrepresentation if that was the only thing we took from that vote. So I think there were all kinds of things going on there in terms of the amount of power that's been drained out of local areas, the way in which so many areas have simply not been given the support that they need. And maybe the government's kind of finally woken up to that with the famous levelling up project, but that's just so utterly inadequate. It's still pitching places in competition with one another to try and fight for ever diminishing pots of money.
This is a terrible admission to make. I had no idea how interesting and potentially important Caroline Lucas was until after she announced that she was leaving Parliament. And I should have done. Her new book, Another England, How to Reclaim Our National Story, is a work of art and considerable intellectual prowess as well. I really do urge you to A, listen to the podcast on full disclosure, and B, read the book. The right of hijacked Englishness, can it be reclaimed? She asks. And that's something that we should all be concerned about. I should apologise. I described myself a moment ago as the king of woke, which is a terribly gender-specific way of describing my role. I'm obviously the monarch of woke. The monarch of the woke. I use the monarch of the woke, a bit like the monarch of the Glen, but the woke. I am the monarch of the woke. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, the official LBC app, where you can also pause and rewind live radio. Download it now for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it's Tom Swarbrick. But now it's time for Sheila Fogarty. 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 But now it's